Story number 1. I have learned there are silences that warn you, silences heavier than weather, that press so steadily against your ribs you forget you were ever breathing without instruction.
That night the forest didn't sing, it listened. And when a place that old listens, you either pay attention or you get taught to.
I sat alone in the ranger cabin the park loans to those of us who trade sleep for watchfulness, grateful for a quiet that kept my thoughts tidy, until I realized the quiet wasn't a gift but a verdict. The knock that came was not a request. It was fear that had chosen a door and found mine. Before I saw the wound, before the iron smell reached me, I knew something had stepped across the line we pretend exists only to keep ourselves comfortable. I'm Ranger Michael Torres. The sequoias around Grant Grove have outlived empires and arguments, and on most nights they tolerate mine. People imagine the backcountry as a symphony, wind, insects, water muttering over stones. But fear isn't born from noise, and fear is born when everything goes still and stays that way. Not resting, not sleeping, but considering you. The park was entering its quiet period, that eerie time when the forest seemed to hold its breath, and every sound carried for miles through the thin mountain air. I had settled in, the stove breathing steady heat, my logbook open like a placid pond, when that stillness grew tight as a snare. I checked my radio the way a man checks a lock he already turned. Routine is a ranger's balm. Fill the forms, patrol the loops, note a leaning signpost. I was halfway through writing about a fallen trail marker when the door shuddered under a pounding I could feel in my teeth. I crossed the cabin in 3 long steps and opened to 2 strangers lit pale by the porch light. One held the other upright at the shoulders. The supporter, Sarah, was all squared jaw and short hair, the sort of face that chooses action over debate. The one being held, Lisa, kept her left arm crushed to her chest, sleeve dark where it shouldn't be. They weren't drunk and they weren't careless. Their eyes had the brittle focus of people whose choices have narrowed to exactly one. Torres immediately ushered them inside, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. I set water to heat because hands need work when minds are slipping. I asked permission to see Lisa's arm. Sarah kept talking as I encouraged, so the truth could peel away from panic. The jacket clung to bad gauze. I talked Lisa through each step as I loosened the fabric. Underneath, the wound didn't look like chaos, it looked like intention. The bite mark on her forearm was unlike anything he'd encountered in his 8 years as a ranger. I am the he in that sentence. I wrote it later. But the certainty was born right there. 4 punctures, not 2, canine in suggestion, but wrong in spacing and arc. Wrong in the way depth spoke of force without frenzy. The edges of the puncture wounds were clean, almost clinical, as if whatever had bitten Lisa had known exactly where to place its teeth for maximum effect without causing fatal damage. I cleaned what I could, wrapped what needed wrapping, and let Sarah rewind the night. And she said they'd chosen a clearing well off any map, an earthen bowl beneath boughs so broad they felt like a roof you could trust. They pitched the tent with the gentle attention of people who believe competency buys favor from the dark. And then there was the breathing outside the nylon, not panting, measured, deliberate. The kind of breath you hear in hospital corridors when someone is learning the shape of pain. It lasted long enough for Sarah to doubt herself and then stopped all at once. The stop was worse than the breathing. Sarah lay rigid and counted, because counting is the thin bridge between denial and action. Pressure dimpled the tent wall near Lisa's head, shoulder height. A deliberate press that made fabric complain and a human gasp break open. Movement followed, precise and fast. Something narrow and hard-lined, like a jaw stripped to its purpose. closed over Lisa's arm through the nylon, and released in a single, exact decision. No thrashing, no second attempt, no tearing that ragged animals leave behind when hunger and inexperience mix, and then absence, hard, surgical absence. When I asked what she heard in that aftermath, Sarah stared at me as if sound itself had betrayed us. There was no sound of retreat, no crashing through underbrush or fading footsteps. I radioed for transport. I promised to hike to the site at first light for their gear. I told them these incidents, rare as they are, have a way of ending in a single spasm. Sarah's look said I was selling comfort. Lisa's said I should keep selling it anyway. They drank the tea with both hands. I watched heat return to their cheeks and told myself that warmth could stand in for safety. Just for an hour, dawn peeled the world into edges. Trails I can walk with my eyes half closed asked me to open them all the way. Tracking is reading, and reading is a conversation with what the ground is willing to admit. That morning, the earth clamped its jaw. The clearing waited exactly where Sarah described, a shallow bowl ringed in red pillars. Needles spread like quiet snowfall. The tent leaned, one corner, talked by haste rather than weather, and sleeping bags sprawled like shrugged skins. A mug on its side had dried a crescent of cold coffee the color of river stone. The lantern had fallen, but not broken. Blood dotted the nylon at a height that made the scene mechanically believable and emotionally obscene. I walked slow circles, letting my eyes unfocus the way you do when you search for constellations in a sky that pretends to be blank. I found nothing. No smear, no print, no fern crushed by weight, trying to remember how to be stealthy. I pressed my palm to the soil as if the ground might still hold the heat of passage. It returned only the old chill of Sierra earth. The forest offered me distant water and a judging jay, ordinary gifts meant to say the extraordinary had left and would not sign the guest book. The complete absence of any such evidence at the campsite was more unsettling than finding strange tracks would have been. I measured the dimple in the tent wall, photographed what could be photographed, and cut a thread of nylon for a lab that would later shrug at me with the eloquence of silence. My radio hiccuped once and then behaved. I told myself the ridge sat unfavorably between me and the tower. You tell yourself many true things in wild places and just as many useful lies. On the hike out, I catalogued teeth. Coyotes tear because tearing turns small into edible. Bears crush because certainty is a bone-deep economy. Mountain lions take breath because breath is the coin the world respects. None of those signatures matched Lisa's arm. 4 precise punctures spoke of a tool rejecting waste. It spoke of design. And when the wild chooses design over appetite, it isn't hunting, it's declaring. Back at the cabin, I filled boxes and lines, the ritual that translates the impossible into bureaucracy. I left out the part where the gaps between trunks felt occupied, not because I feared laughter, but because I wanted someone to believe the parts I could defend with tape measure and camera. I turned in samples to a lab that never called, then stood at the big visitor map where children point with 2 hands and parents point with 1, and traced the clean line from trail to clearing. What draws a thing that bites but doesn't feed? Why take just enough to say, here, at the hospital? Fluorescence diluted the wound's horror into something the camera could inventory. The ER doctor had the competent calm of a person who has met too many midnights. He had images on a tablet and a voice that wouldn't participate in drama. Most disturbing was the doctor's observation that the bite appeared to have been delivered with restraint. Restraint is an ugly word in a wildland context. Predators don't practice it unless the prey is lesson, not meal. Sarah told it all again. She apologized for crying and didn't. She apologized for screaming and apologized for apologizing. I told her the forest doesn't take offense. She spoke about the shape she'd seen through nylon, the way it climbed the tent wall like water deciding to be vertical. She described seeing a silhouette against the tent wall that appeared human in shape, but moved with an unnatural fluidity like liquid shadow given form. Her mouth made that phrase carefully, as if saying it wrong might make it true. I left the staff to their glass and gauze, stepped into a corridor where posters nag about hands and hearts, and sat in the truck with the smell of pine and disinfectant fighting inside my head. I wrote a sentence I didn't want any of my colleagues to have to read. Unknown animal, 4-point puncture, pattern inconsistent with local fauna. Recommend temporary closure of dispersed sites in that quadrant. I knew what closures do to public patients, to budgets, to the story we sell about parks as safe containers for curated wonder. I wrote it anyway. Days wore their usual faces. Families laughed in glades that have practiced indifference to laughter for centuries. Hikers asked about mileage to waterfalls as if beauty were a distance you could achieve. At night, I walked the loops alone and listened not for growls or branches breaking, but for that lean syllable of breath that means you are being considered by something that owes you nothing. Officially, I documented an animal attack by an unknown species, because that is how you keep the phones from catching fire. Unofficially, I went hunting for stories that live in the joints of this job, the field school confessions over burnt coffee, the radio pause before someone says, "You didn't hear this from me." I called a ranger in the northwest. Had he ever seen a bite that looked like a diagram? He went quiet and told me about a climber who limped off a wall with neat punctures in the thigh, spaced wider than any canine he'd measured. No prints in the scree, no hair. A medic wrote, "Clean," as if cleanliness were a virtue in a wound. A desert biologist texted me a scanned page from a notebook old enough to have its own dust, 4 dots in a square, and the word precise. She'd never found scat, never found hair, never found the normal breadcrumbs wild biology drops when it wants to be understood. Patterns are dangerous. Draw enough lines between stars and you invent heroes and monsters, but the points insisted. 4 punctures, surgical placement, evidence that refused to perform for our rules. What he discovered was a pattern of similar encounters, always involving bite wounds with the same unusual characteristics, always occurring in remote wilderness areas, and always lacking any physical evidence of the attacker. When I wrote that sentence into a memo and sent it nowhere, I started carrying extra bandages on evening rounds, not because gauze stops old intentions, but because the act of preparing steals a little power back from what you can't name. I paused more at meadow edges for reasons no daily report could accept. I learned the difference between fear and respect. Fear is a chain you drag and call it prudence. Respect is the weight that sits in your palm and makes your grip better. I returned to the clearing once, not to tempt anything, not to prove a point, and to apologize for misunderstanding the terms of coexistence. I set the lantern upright, zipped the torn tent door as if tidiness could undo history, gathered the scattered kit into a small domestic heap. Then I stood still and let my breathing adopt the place's rhythm. If something listened, it did so without rush, without gift, without hostility. The neutrality of old stone. If I've changed, it isn't toward fear, it's toward attention. I walk softer. I listen harder. Some evenings I step outside the cabin and leave the porch light on, not for the forest's sake. The oldest inhabitants do not require courtesy, but for my own. When the air thinks about freezing and the ground remembers old snow, I listen. Sometimes the forest speaks in its usual dialect and I relax into chores. Sometimes it adopts that other voice made of waiting, and Lisa's arm returns to me. 4 holes like a signature, not a meal. There are details I rarely admit because they sound like superstition until you've lived beside them long enough to call them field notes. A compass that twitched once and then behaved like a heartbeat remembering itself. A camera trap that triggered without a subject and produced 12 frames of perfect black, as if presence had visited and refused to be seen. An odor that wasn't musk or rot or spray, but the antiseptic bite of new plastic just unwrapped. I wrote none of that in the official file. I am generous with data when the data will be respected. Some things need a different archive. Colleagues say I'm more cautious now. They're right. Caution is how you keep serving a place you love without lying to it. I train new rangers to read what's present and what's missing, to honor tracks and absences in equal measure. In an old note to myself, I wrote. Years later, Torres still works at Kings Canyon. I still do because work is a promise to the ground, to the people who ask for maps, and to whatever shares these woods with us. Some nights I draft sentences I will never submit. Restraint is not mercy. It is warning. The forest isn't haunted. It is inhabited. Whatever bit, Lisa did not make a mistake. It extended a boundary into canvas and skin and waited to see if we would notice. We did. It has not repeated here, or if it has, it was as careful as before. Perhaps that's the message written in 4 teeth. Not hunger, not hatred, but a claim drawn with geometry where we assumed wilderness could only scribble. If you come small. Pack out your trash. Drown your fires. Don't tell the quiet to be quiet. Listen to it. Leave the animals to their lawful paths and the old trees to their long counsels. And if, in the middle of the night, the wind forgets to move the branches and the world holds its breath as if measuring you, remember 2 women who ran until a cabin door accepted their fear. Remember the bite that chose not to take more. And remember there are neighbors who live here with us, close enough to touch and careful enough not to. I have never seen the thing that did it, or perhaps I have. And seen insists on eyes when recognition has other instruments. I know only this. There is a silence the forest keeps for itself. And when it falls, you should move with respect. I am patient. I am listening. The cabin is small, the park is vast, and between my rounds and what watches from the interstices, there is an agreement built of restraint and distance. I intend to honor it. Story number 2. I don't tell new rangers about the circles. I tell them about frost-bitten tourists, stubborn bison, and how the valley hordes sound like a cathedral, but not about the geometry that walks after dark. I meant to keep the night ordinary: paperwork, radio checks, stars bright as flint, then a voice braided tight with fear cut through the speaker. And ordinary split down the middle. There's a secret the park keeps better than any vault. The moment everything living goes quiet at once. As if a hand closes over the world's mouth. My belt carries a penlight, a sidearm, and a faith in rules that usually keeps monsters at bay. Usually. By the time I reached the Slow Creek turnoff, the moon wore a cloud like a veil and the trees looked a step closer than they had any right to be. I am Ranger David Chen. I've spent enough nights in Lamar Valley to sort reasonable fears from the kind that pretend to be reasonable. Family emergencies in the backcountry usually involved medical issues, bear encounters, or equipment failures, but that report felt crooked before I ever saw the campsite. But the dispatcher's voice had carried an unusual tension when relaying the message. The name read Morrison, parents with a young boy. They weren't moving. They wouldn't move. The family had specifically requested immediate ranger assistance and refused to leave their campsite until help arrived, which was unusual behavior for campers experiencing typical wilderness problems. The meadow opened like a dark bowl. Their tent glowed, too bright, too many sources. A siege made of store-bought light. When Chen arrived at the designated campsite, he found the Morrison family huddled together inside their large family tent with every battery-powered lantern they owned blazing around the perimeter. The father stepped out, shoulders ironed flat by nerves. Tom Morrison, a software engineer from Denver, emerged from the tent looking haggarded and exhausted despite the early hour. He kept trying to stare past me, as if the answer he needed was standing just over my shoulder. His wife, Jennifer, remained inside with their 8-year-old son, Marcus, who Chen could hear whimpering softly in the background. "Tell me what you saw," I said, and Tom's breath hitched like a machine that had to spin up. They took turns, passing the account between them like a hot pan. The first sign that something was wrong came around 900 p.m. when the normal sounds of the wilderness began to fade. The creek's chatter turned to a whisper I couldn't hear. Even the distant sounds of the slow creek, which had provided a constant background murmur throughout the day, seemed muffled and distant. Jennifer kept her voice even while her hands trembled while cleaning up after dinner. She'd caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. Dark shapes that seemed to shift and flow just beyond the reach of their campfire light. Initially, she dismissed these as tricks of the flickering flames or her imagination. But as the evening progressed, as the movements became more pronounced and deliberate, Tom's delivery changed when he talked about shapes. He became an engineer again, measuring with careful nouns. Tom described how the shadows began to take on more defined shapes, around 10 p. What had started as vague movements in the darkness gradually resolved into humanoid silhouettes that appeared to be circling their campsite at a distance of roughly 50 yards. He described angles, spacing, a cadence. The figures moved with an unnatural gait, sometimes upright like humans, other times dropping to all fours and moving with an animal-like fluidity that defied easy categorization. Marcus poked his head out of the tent flap as if counting could break a spell. He had the steady calm of a kid who's decided the world is a quiz, and he has studied. 7, he said, and I believed him. They maintained consistent spacing as they circled the campsite, never approaching closer than 50 yards, but never retreating beyond the edge of visibility, despite moving through terrain covered with dry leaves, fallen branches, and loose rocks. The shadows made no audible noise. That last part loosened something at the base of my spine. Silence is a shape too, and I recognized this one. I did what training and habit required. I made small talk to lower their pulse. I walked the perimeter just outside their light, where certainty ends and pretending begins. My beam grabbed only grass and scrub, but the ground keeps better minutes than people. The ground around the Morrison family's tent showed clear evidence of the circular movement Tom had described. It was a pale ring, a negative halo. I unrolled my tape and measured because numbers are how I talk myself down. A distinct path had been worn into the earth at exactly 50 yards from their tent, forming a perfect circle that showed signs of repeated use by multiple individuals. Exactly. Exactly was the part I couldn't file under elk, prank, or bad luck. I didn't tell them that. I told them we'd leave in convoy the second I said so. They nodded, like people nod to a surgeon who doesn't have time to lie. We packed the tent half closed, threw the loose into the cargo hold, and pulled out with our lights combing the road ahead. Somewhere behind me, in a meadow the map marks as ordinary. A circle cooled in the dirt and waited for someone to ask the wrong questions. Daylight has a way of making liars of fear. When the sun braided gold through the grass, I returned alone. The ring remained, arrogant in its clarity. I walked it with a compass and notebook, and not because a circle needs a compass, but because a ranger needs ritual when the world stops behaving like a park brochure. The diameter held steady, no matter where I set the tape. I've seen snowmobile donuts and campfire dares and elk bedding circles. None carried that steadiness of mind. I widened my search because the land felt like it was hinting. 50 yards kept coming back like a chorus. Beyond the first campsite, I found a second ring, same size total, same bite taken out of the ground, then a third. Whatever had circled the Morrison family was engaged in systematic behavior that extended far beyond a single incident. Systematic is a cozy word in a report. Out here, it is teeth. Back at the station, I wrote it up the way you're supposed to. Nouns, tidy. Verbs, behaved. I avoided the word perfect. Perfect draws questions you can't survive. I read back through old logs and found the gaps where people had written around the truth. Some said unusual activity, some disturbance, some just request for escort. There were failures of language I recognized, silences where the writer had backed away from the sentence. When I ran out of paper to read, I went online, not the parts of the internet where mysteries are costumes, the parts where people who are careful with facts still admit to the edges of things. He spent countless hours online connecting with other campers and outdoor enthusiasts who reported comparable encounters. What he discovered was a pattern of incidents spanning decades, all involving families or small groups who reported being circled by shadowy figures in remote wilderness areas. The words repeated across geography and years. Circle, silence, counting, no tracks, the gradual tightening of the perimeter. And at the end, a kind of quiet that didn't feel like relief. I won't pretend the job didn't follow me home. You can hang up a radio, you can't hang up a pattern once it takes your measurements on patrol. I felt arithmetic happening somewhere just behind my left shoulder. If I stopped, it stopped. If I walked, it walked. I told myself I was tired. Tired explains most hauntings, and news reached me through a counselor friend that the Morrisons weren't sleeping. Marcus left lights blazing like a lighthouse you could see from space. Their experience serves as a stark reminder that some encounters in the wilderness leave wounds that never fully heal and scars that persist long after the physical danger has passed. I'd seen wounds you can wrap gauze around. This one refused bandages. I called a meeting that wasn't a meeting. Coffee in paper cups. A whiteboard nobody needed. I pitched a change in posture. Evacuate fast when a call smells like circles. Don't waste the night making the inexplicable pose for photographs. But he's developed protocols for responding to similar reports that prioritize immediate evacuation over investigation. He's learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when the cost of understanding comes at the expense of human psychological well-being, and policy reads like caution on paper. In the field, it reads like mercy. I went back on a day so clean you could shave in the reflection of the sky. I carried string, stakes, and a carpenter's level because superstition likes to dress up as science, and I set a chair dead center in the primary ring and sat. If I was going to ask for an answer, I would do it politely. No howl announced anything. The first sound to go was the creak, not silence, pressure, the way air feels under a storm that doesn't break. Birds clipped their songs mid-syllable. Even the bugs seemed to accept a memo I hadn't seen. I remembered Jennifer's confession, and the prickle returned to my arms while cleaning up after dinner. She'd caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to shift and flow just beyond the reach of their campfire light. That phrasing, flow, was exactly right. I held my seat because running is a kind of promise, and I didn't want to promise anything. The world at the edges of my sight began to settle into intention. Tom described how the shadows began to take on more defined shapes. They were tall until they weren't. They were on two legs until four made more sense to them. The figures moved with an unnatural gait, sometimes upright like humans, other times dropping to all fours and moving with an animal-like fluidity that defied easy categorization. They didn't enter the circle, they made the circle, and I, fool that I am, sat inside it like punctuation. Distance became a rule I could taste. They maintained consistent spacing as they circled the campsite, never approaching closer than 50 yards, but never retreating beyond the edge of visibility. I felt myself inventoried, weight, height, breath rate, while the equation considered whether I belonged where I was, despite moving through terrain covered with dry leaves, fallen branches, and loose rocks. The shadows made no audible noise, but the quiet was so complete I could hear my pulse doubt itself. I tried 3 experiments. I stood. Nothing changed. I stepped forward 2 paces. The pressure held like a door with a chair jammed under the knob. I stepped back and sat. Something eased, barely. The lesson was humiliating in its simplicity. The circle was the subject. I was an incidental object placed at the center to see if I would understand. When the star I think of as first lighted above the ridge, the pressure released like a held breath. I backed out without showing my spine. On the way to the truck, I found a second ring fainter than a bruise, and I understood that someone had brought a compass to a place that shouldn't know about compasses. The footage on my phone later showed nothing a skeptic couldn't laugh at. Trees, wind, my own voice whispering a narrative I couldn't bear to write down afterward, but the ground told its truth. Crushed stems at perfect intervals. The ground around the Morrison family's tent showed clear evidence of the circular movement Tom had described. A distinct path had been worn into the earth at exactly 50 yards from their tent, forming a perfect circle that showed signs of repeated use by multiple individuals. I stopped looking for tracks. Chen found no footprints or other identifying marks along the worn path, despite the soft earth that should have clearly shown any human or animal tracks. The absence of physical evidence was consistent with other unexplained incidents he'd encountered during his tenure at Yellowstone, cases that seemed to exist in the gray area between documented fact and inexplicable phenomenon. Word travels strangely in parks. Camp hosts hear things before radios do. An RV couple rolled into the station one afternoon with their laughter cut short. Both pairs of hands wrapped around paper cups too tightly. They'd lost their nerve beside Slow Creek and wanted a different assignment from the night. I walked the loop after clock out because some part of me believed in reciprocity. If the pattern watched me, I should watch it. At the decoy site I'd set earlier, a tent too bright, a pot hung wrong, a tableau staged to irritate any intelligence. There was that pressure again. Shadows rehearsed themselves, just out of courtesy range. The mathematical precision of their movement suggested intelligence and coordination that went far beyond animal behavior. This time the geometry showed off. 3 rings, nested, ripples that refused to forget what made them. I waited for a crossing that never came. Maybe the crossing wasn't the point. Inside the decoy tent, nothing was moved, but everything felt touched, like a museum after closing. A single juniper tip inside the line held 1 silver hair. I bagged it even though I couldn't label it. A proof without a category is just a provocation. Screens found me again after midnight. He spent countless hours online connecting with other campers and outdoor enthusiasts who reported comparable encounters. What he discovered was a pattern of incidents spanning decades, all involving families or small groups who reported being circled by shadowy figures in remote wilderness areas. The common elements across these reports were remarkably consistent: the perfect circular movement, the complete silence of the figures, the gradual tightening of the perimeter, and the absence of any physical evidence after the fact. And at the end of many posts came the same confession: sleep no longer arrives when you turn out the light. You have to go looking for it, and you rarely catch it. I thought of Marcus building his lighthouse out of switches. Most disturbing was the psychological impact on witnesses, particularly children, who seemed to be more susceptible to long-term trauma from these encounters. I called the family one afternoon with no particular reason but the correct one. Marcus answered, and I listened to him breathe like waves. We talked about school and how counting can be a raft. I wrote the driest memo of my career. It said nothing any reporter would want to print and everything a ranger needed to hear. Move them first. Ask later. Don't argue with distance. Don't provoke an equation with a flashlight and a bad plan. But he's developed protocols for responding to similar reports that prioritize immediate evacuation over investigation. He's learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when the cost of understanding comes at the expense of human psychological well-being. Sometimes, professionalism is knowing how to back away from a question. I still walk the place's maps color green when the moon allows. Some rings fade like chalk in rain, Some look as if they were drawn this afternoon by a hand that doesn't slip. He discovered that the circular paths would gradually fade over time if left undisturbed, but would be renewed whenever new camping activity occurred in the area. This suggested that whatever created the paths was responding to human presence in a calculated and purposeful manner. The consistency of the accounts across different geographic regions and time periods suggested a phenomenon that was both widespread and persistent, yet somehow remained largely unknown to the general public. I have learned, finally, to teach without telling. New rangers get the rules humans can keep and the humility for the rules we didn't write. I don't take them to the circles. I take them to places where wolves stitch dawn into something you can wear for the rest of the day. If you camp where the map shows only green and the creek goes quiet all at once, if the dark takes out a compass and begins to measure you, don't bargain, don't posture, step into your light and let yourself be small. If a ranger arrives with taillights, you can follow. Believe him? Their experience serves as a stark reminder that some encounters in the wilderness leave wounds that never fully heal, scars that persist long after the physical danger has passed. Some patterns are more patient than people, and patience can be a kind of strength we aren't built to match. I still work the night shift in Lamar Valley. Chen still works the night shift in Lamar Valley. I still file reports that look ordinary on paper and feel like confessions when I sign them. I still photograph circles that show up as nothing in the lens and everything underfoot. And when the radio clicks alive with that particular quiet on the other end, I don't wonder anymore whether it's real. I ask where they are and tell them I'm coming. Story number 3. I was trained to map trails, not the edges of reality. The first time I saw the staircase, the forest didn't open a path for me. It erased one. By the 10th step, something in me understood that ascent can be a kind of unmaking. We were told to document, to measure, to leave mysteries intact for the sake of safety, and no one warned us what safety costs. If you ever find steps climbing out of moss with no house to claim them, leave the woods the way you found them, breathing and behind you. I'm Patricia Williams, a ranger who once believed the wilderness could be squared to coordinates and folded into a binder. Paper makes even the most unruly terrain behave. A ravine becomes a contour line, a thicket, a shade of green, water. A symbol you can annotate with flow and depth. I loved that obedience. It meant the world was manageable, that my work was an honest transaction, effort traded for certainty. The staircase corrected me. Certainty is a luxury. Duty is the invoice. I did not meet it as a skeptic or a believer, only as a worker moving from task to task. The day had the quiet of a library and the damp of a laundromat. When I broke through salal and swordfern, when the understory stepped back just enough to show me a small clearing of breathless air, I saw what was waiting. A domestic shape promoted to icon, rising from the forest floor, surrounded by ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks, stood a perfectly preserved wooden staircase. The structure was remarkable in its ordinariness. Constructed from what appeared to be standard residential lumber, the staircase featured a simple handrail and 12 steps leading upward to nothing. There was no house, no building foundation, no structure of any kind that would explain its presence. The staircase simply existed, as if someone had carefully extracted it from a suburban home and placed it randomly in the forest. I paced around it the way divers circle a hole cut in ice, measuring fear in passes. The handrail gleamed, the way wood gleams when it's still telling itself it's a tree. A beetle inspected the second riser and decided it had no business there. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the staircase's condition, despite being exposed to the Pacific Northwest's notorious rainfall and humidity. The wood showed no signs of rot, weathering, or insect damage. The lumber appeared freshly cut and recently installed with sharp edges and clean joints that suggested recent construction, yet the forest around it had clearly grown undisturbed for decades. I pressed my palm to a tread and felt neutral temperature, no chill, no stored warmth, like touching a photograph of wood rather than wood itself. I photographed, measured, mapped. The rituals of documentation are a kind of prayer, with massive trees and established undergrowth that would have taken years to develop. Williams documented the staircase's location and dimensions, photographing it from multiple angles while trying to develop a rational explanation for its presence. Her initial theory involved illegal dumping or abandoned construction projects. But the staircase's perfect condition and the surrounding forest's undisturbed state made these explanations increasingly unlikely. I scraped at the soil and found no footprint of a post hole, no crushed root flare, no story of force. I made notes anyway, because notes are what we make when meaning will not volunteer. Back at the station, I asked Captain Rodriguez whether the park had ever logged anything similar. He met my question with a pause that felt older than both of us. We went to the archive. The cabinet smelled of paper aging at different speeds, folder after folder. The same offense, immaculate steps marooned in honest wilderness, and each report described the same basic phenomenon. Well-constructed wooden staircases appearing in remote wilderness areas with no logical explanation for their presence. Rodriguez shared files documenting 17 separate staircase discoveries across the park system, each one photographed and GPS located but never removed or explained. What they shared was their inexplicable presence in locations where no human construction should exist. The camera angles changed, the flora changed, sometimes even the species of wood changed. The refusal to belong did not. The language of the reports taught me what the stairs did to minds. At first, the words are professional, metric, trained. Then, at a certain point in the climb, the prose loses its scaffolding. Multiple rangers had reported an overwhelming compulsion to climb the structures, describing an almost hypnotic attraction that grew stronger the longer they remained in proximity to the stairs. Several rangers had climbed partway up before experiencing sudden, inexplicable terror that forced them to retreat. One file bulged with addenda, as if explanation could be bullied into existence by quantity. According to his incident report, Thompson felt as if he was ascending into something that violated fundamental laws of reality, a space where normal physics and logic no longer applied. The sentence scared me, not because of its drama, but because of its plainness. We speak simply when the truth embarrasses vocabulary. I told myself that professional curiosity is not the same as hunger. I told myself that I could approach, examine, and step away. That is what training promises. Approach neutrality. But approach neutrality dissolves in the presence of an object that behaves like an idea. I prepared like a coward who respects her fear. She prepared carefully, bringing communication equipment and arranging for regular check-ins with the ranger station. The ascent began normally enough. The first few steps felt solid and ordinary, no different from climbing stairs in any building. At the fourth step, my ears felt as if pressure had changed, but the barometer on my wrist insisted I was imagining it. By the sixth step, Williams began experiencing the disorientation other rangers had described. The forest around her seemed to shift and blur, as if she was viewing it through water or thick glass. Sounds became muffled and distorted, with familiar forest noises taking on alien qualities that made her skin crawl. I could still name the trees, I could still read the slope, but naming and reading no longer guaranteed belonging. The seventh step placed my chest where my feet thought they weren't. A carpenter, somewhere in my body, whispered about pitch and rise and run, about code and comfort. The rest of me understood that no code had jurisdiction here. The sensation of climbing became disconnected from physical reality, as if she was ascending through space rather than up a physical structure. A wind that wasn't a wind moved along the rail from above and below at once. In my mind, a picture tried to form, a room you can only draw if you give up rectangles, and then unformed itself out of kindness. The eighth step wanted a promise from me. I withheld it. My boot hovered, then retreated to the safety of the seventh. Breath counted itself without being asked. I raised my eyes and realized I could not look past the 10th step, the way you cannot look into a word you have not yet learned to pronounce. Williams reached the 10th step before the terror hit her with overwhelming force. She described the experience as encountering something fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness, a presence or reality that her mind couldn't process without risking permanent damage. The fear wasn't rational or explainable, but absolute and primal, triggering every survival instinct she possessed. I stepped down, down, down. Not running, not dignified either. A person returning a borrowed item before the library notices it's missing. Back on ground, the forest resumed being the forest with such competence that I wanted to apologize to it for doubting. I logged my check-in, tamped the site with my gaze, and left at a pace that only looked calm from the outside. At the station, paperwork absorbed me like a sponge absorbs a spill. The incident report she filed was deliberately vague, focusing on the staircase's physical characteristics rather than her psychological experience during the climb. I obeyed the template because the template protects careers and sometimes bodies. I assigned the sector to other rangers. Citing logistics I pretended were constraints rather than excuses. Williams never returned to the staircase's location. Distance made my days cleaner and my nights complicated. In sleep, I walked hallways that connected to other hallways, and finally to a landing that refused to host a door. The archive called again. I answered because refusal is also a kind of consent if you do it long enough. Thompson had climbed to the 8th step of a 12-step structure when he reported experiencing what he described as absolute wrongness. Thompson's description of his experience became increasingly incoherent as he attempted to explain what he'd encountered on those upper steps. He wrote about feeling disconnected from his own body, experiencing time distortion, and sensing the presence of something vast and malevolent watching him from above. Their reports, heavily redacted in the official files, described encounters with phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. I copied passages by hand until the words looked like symbols. Freed from their obligations to mean, I asked the only question that felt productive: why stairs? A road implies company, a trail implies history, a bridge implies negotiation, stairs imply intent. Stairs are for going somewhere specific, often indoors, often up. Their promise is intimate and directional. To place that promise without context is to commit a kind of architectural blasphemy. The National Park Service's official position on the staircases remained deliberately vague. Internal memos Williams obtained through informal channels indicated that the service was aware of the phenomenon but had chosen not to investigate it systematically. The reasoning, according to these documents, was that the staircases posed no immediate threat to public safety, and that investigation might draw unwanted attention to areas better left undisturbed. The logic tries to be a dam and becomes a spillway. What we refuse to pursue may pursue us with better shoes. I moved to a desk. The field did not move out of me. Calls arrive from people who want a veteran to understand them without needing to be convinced. Photographs arrive too. Oaks framing a perfect U-turn of steps. Basalt carved into flights that should have been quarried and weren't. A set of risers entirely mirrored, so the world beneath them looked brighter than the world above. Park services have developed informal protocols for dealing with discoveries, emphasizing documentation over investigation and strongly discouraging rangers from climbing the structures. The official stance remains that the staircases are unexplained but harmless, though internal communications suggest a much deeper concern about their true nature and purpose. The punctuation never admits it. I maintain a private ledger. In it, every account of ascent shares one confession. The decision to climb did not feel like a decision. The closer you are, the more your thoughts come pre-phrased, as if the stairs have drafted them for you in a voice you trust. I write that down over and over, because repetition teaches the body what the mind resists. The ledger has its own ritual now. I touch the corner of the page before I start writing. The way you touch the rail before you climb. People ask me what's at the top, and I tell them I don't know. And this is true, but I can tell them what lies just below the top. A pressure that is not weather, an attention that is not animal, and a welcome that does not mind being mistaken for daring. The phenomenon continues to this day, with new staircases appearing regularly in wilderness areas across the country. That line belongs to my official voice. The next lines come from the person the stairs tried to edit. If you find stairs in the woods, document them, report them, but never, under any circumstances or climb them. Curiosity is brave when it chooses its battles. It is foolish when the battle chooses it. If this sounds like fear speaking, credit the staircase for its clarity. There are thresholds that care nothing for the stories we want from them. There are climbs that turn you into a measurement. I refuse to be what the step above me intended to record. Story number 4. I have worn this badge for 15 years, but the woods taught me to measure distance by breath, not by miles. Some nights the forest holds its own counsel, and on those nights I feel it studying me back. People think we lose hikers to cliffs and weather. I have learned that some losses begin with perfect planning and end with a circle no map will admit exists. I tell new rangers that fear is just information asking for a plan. Then there are days when the information refuses to speak our language. If you ever step beneath the hemlocks of Bone Valley, keep your itinerary in your pocket and your attention in your bones. The search for Sarah Mitchell began on a Tuesday morning in October 2020, when her failure to return from a solo hiking trip triggered one of the most disturbing search and rescue operations in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history. I didn't need the call sheet to remember the date. It is written into the rhythm of my pulse, the way old injuries predict rain. Radios chattered in crisp, functional phrases, and I answered them like a metronome, steady because someone had to be. Ranger Captain Lisa Rodriguez had coordinated dozens of missing person searches during her 15-year career. I had seen storms, close roads, rivers erase footprints, and cliffs argue with gravity. But the way this one started, a clean itinerary, no weather events, a hiker who respected the backcountry, put me on the defensive against a threat I could not name. We begin with intent. We reconstruct a day from paper, text messages, permits, and the little habits people leave behind, like breadcrumbs. Sarah Mitchell was a 28-year-old graduate student from Knoxville, an experienced hiker who had explored the Smokies extensively over the past 5 years. She wasn't chasing a summit selfie or a record. She was collecting quiet. The kind you can only find when the trees outnumber the words in your head. She'd left detailed trail plans with park services indicating her intention to hike the remote Bone Valley Trail. She noted water sources, elevation, daylight, and contingency routes with the tidy precision of someone who respected risk rather than flirting with it. When you look at a missing person's route, you put your finger on the map and feel for what the paper cannot say, where solitude pulls, where the grade tricks tired legs, where the understory thickens. When Sarah failed to return by her scheduled check-in time, her roommate contacted park authorities, initiating a search protocol that would soon reveal something far more sinister than a typical hiking accident. I assembled teams at first light, parceled the woods into search grids, and sent good people into the places we usually tell visitors to avoid without company. The air was clean, the stream crossings polite, the sky a clear, forgettable blue. Nothing about the conditions offered us a culprit to arrest. We stepped out under a ceiling of hemlock and tulip poplar. The ground kept secrets in a 2-inch layer of leaves that gave way just enough to record pressure without confessing details. I worked with Tom Bradley, the best tracker I've ever known, a man who could read the ground like a ledger and tell you which entries were written in panic. We moved with quiet economy, the way you do when you want the woods to keep listening rather than notice you as a problem to solve. The GPS breadcrumbed our path. My notebook took the rest. I took a breath, and the day took me back to when I was new at this. How simple I thought the forest was. How little I understood about order masquerading as chaos. The first sign that something was wrong came when the search team located Sarah's abandoned backpack approximately 4 miles into the Bone Valley Trail. It wasn't tossed, wasn't torn. The pack was found sitting upright beside the trail, positioned as if Sarah had simply set it down for a rest break. I circled it without touching, photographing from every quarter, logging coordinates, narrating each action into my recorder so later I could audit my memory against the facts. Nothing appeared to be missing from the pack's contents, including valuable items like her camera, GPS device, and emergency supplies that would typically be taken by someone in distress. I've seen panic repack a bag like a storm. This was a still life arranged by a calm hand. We cast a wider net around the trail, slow and deliberate. Bradley lowered to one knee, then both. The forest became very articulate in the way only a patient listener can hear. The search team's tracking specialist, Ranger Tom Bradley, discovered the first blood evidence approximately 50 yards from the backpack location. He didn't speak. He simply stepped aside so I could kneel where he had been and read the ground. Not spatter, not a smear from a fall, beads. Determined and paced, the drops were evenly spaced, roughly 18 in apart, creating a trail that was almost geometrically precise in its consistency. I measured 3 intervals, then 5. Then I stopped measuring because the answer refused to change. We left the comfort of the trail like divers leaving daylight. The blood led us outward, avoiding roots and rocks as if guided by a surveyor. No drag marks, no signs of someone stumbling, grabbing at saplings, pinballing through the understory, just the insistence of those red beads, steady as heartbeats that never stuttered. I reported our bearing and pace, redistributed searchers to respect the new vector, and felt my training slide from underneath me like gravel. When the land refuses to behave like land, you start listening for a second language. Bradley, usually chatty in a low but companionable way, went silent. A crow lifted from a nearby branch. The woods did not answer it. Sarah's hiking boots were found placed side by side on a fallen log, positioned with military precision and showing no signs of having been removed in distress. The laces followed the tongues like lines ruled with a straight edge. The leather was dry, the soles were clean. I have seen wilderness strip people to bone and shadow, but when the forest undresses you neatly, it feels like etiquette with a motive. Beyond the log, the earth softened in a patch of humus that loves to record the present. The prints were human in basic shape, but showed anatomical irregularities that Bradley couldn't explain through conventional tracking knowledge. Long toes, a relationship to the ground that suggested purpose more than speed, pressure patterns that didn't match fatigue or injury. He told me what they were not, as if defining the negative could corral the impossible. We advanced as if the air itself required permission. The woods thinned into an area where trunks stood, older and farther apart, each one wearing bark like a history book. I radioed status updates, kept my voice level, then turned the volume down because in that place, even the practical sounds of our work felt like trespass. The blood never varied. The footprints chose lines that made sense to an intelligence I could not attribute. We lost nothing to slope or shadow. The compass behaved like a gentleman, but the hairs on my arms did not. The trail led to a clearing that appeared to be artificially created. The boundary was too clean to call it natural. The geometry offended the way a wrong note offends a musician. A perfect circle of bare earth, surrounded by towering trees, but no char, no stumps of cut saplings, just a disk of earth so worked and firm you could feel the repetition of traffic in your knees, and there, at the center, as if placed by someone who learned ceremony before learning language, Sarah's clothing was arranged in a neat pile. Socks mated and folded, shirt squared, shorts creased along seams that shouldn't hold shape on a trail. Each item folded with care and precision that suggested ritual Rather than random abandonment, I logged our position, then allowed the silence to have me for a full measure of breath because my next words needed to be clean. We widened the perimeter in an exact radius, then widened again. No stray fibers on bark, no hair, no scuffed soil where panic might have argued with reason. The spiral of blood ended where the clothing waited, as if finishing a sentence written in a grammar we didn't share. I called it into command and then made the call I had never wanted to make. Rodriguez contacted federal authorities and expanded the search to include specialized tracking teams and forensic specialists. On the long walk back to the staging area, Bradley kept pace with me like a shadow, and I understood that whatever we had stepped into was not finished with us. Forensic language feels both precise and evasive when you lay it against a forest. Swabs, vials, chains of custody, evidence cones that look absurd in a place that predates your badge by centuries. The blood samples were analyzed and confirmed to be human, matching Sarah's blood type. Then the reports began to carve cautious phrases around anomalies, the way you might tiptoe through a room you don't own, cellular details that behaved as expected, others that could not be crowded into the categories that make funding committees comfortable. The footprint casts returned to us with measurements and pressure indices that offered no match to any known human foot. I have learned that people prefer monsters to ambiguity. At least monsters come with folklore, science. When it hesitates, leaves you alone with your thoughts. We searched until the river forgot our names. Daylight felt like something we borrowed and would have to return with interest. Volunteers rotated out, then refused to rotate back in. Bradley, who once loved the hush of solitary tracking, started requesting assignments near boardwalks crowded with visitors as if human chatter could ground him. Weeks of intensive searching failed to locate any trace of Sarah Mitchell beyond the evidence found in the mysterious clearing. I walked the spiral so often, my dreams learned its arithmetic. I closed my eyes and could feel the distance between drops. A case file is a coffin made of paper where we bury the questions we can't carry in public. The Sarah Mitchell case remains one of the most thoroughly documented unexplained disappearances in National Park Service history. The official language sits straight-backed and calm while my memory paces. There are coordinates we don't print on maps, trails we temporarily reroute for reasons that sound like erosion control. New signs appeared, not to scare the honest, but to remind the reckless that the woods have rules older than ours. The case file continues to grow as similar incidents are reported across the country, suggesting a phenomenon that extends far beyond a single missing person case. Ranger listservs hummed in low tones, a circle here, another in a different state, items folded with care, blood that kept its color too long. Threads began to draw themselves, and I took an administrative post because paper doesn't stare. At a desk, I map patterns no one wants named. I make calls to colleagues who pause before saying, "Yes, we found a circle." As if the word might make another one, I keep photographs in a drawer I open only when the building has settled for the night. The carvings we documented in Bone Valley, symbols cut shallow into bark with a hand that understood how to insult a tree without killing it, mirror marks from northern Georgia, West Virginia, and a forest so far into New England that the vowels in its wind are different. I have not published these parallels because the forest does not reward publicity. It answers with attention. And attention invites a kind of visitor we already have too much of. When a family asks me whether we will ever know, I say what training allows and what hope permits. I talk about probabilities with the respectful certainty that math deserves. Inside, I know that numbers help only until you find a circle that refuses to compute. People ask if Bone Valley is closed now. It is not. We cannot close the past. And the trail is not the danger. The trail is a line written by humans. The danger is the paragraph the forest insists on writing around it. We monitor the clearing the way a doctor monitors a fever that won't declare itself a symptom of anything. We have learned to recognize when the trees feel watchful, and we adjust patrols not because of policy, but because instinct survived long enough to earn a uniform. I am not interested in frightening you. Fear without a plan is theater. I'm interested in accuracy. If you go, tell someone where you are going and why. Leave a plan with times and margins for failure. Bring a second light and the kind of respect that keeps you on the line you promised the forest you would follow. And know this, the woods do not hate you. They do not love you. They do not know you are real. They speak a language of pattern and patience. And once, for a time long enough to rearrange a life. I heard that language. Some places in the wilderness hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, and some trails lead to destinations that no human should ever reach. Story number 5. I was paid to know the forest, but the forest knew how to keep one thing from me. Why a human thumb stared back at me from the skin of a living giant. I can still see the purple sheen on the nail. A small and ordinary color interrupting the holy red of sequoia bark. Someone carried an antique railroad spike into deep backcountry and left a message I was never trained to read. There were no tracks, no scuffs, only a precise wound in the tree and a new rent in my certainty. 17 more spikes would surface before I quit the trails and learned that leaving the woods does not end the woods. I tell this from a desk that smells like toner and coffee. Not sap and dust, but when I close my eyes, I taste the iron of cold air and hear the slow hush of needles as if the grove were breathing above me. Ranger Michael Santos had been patrolling the remote sections of Sequoia National Park for 8 years when he made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his career. That sentence is mine. The preface to the one memory that will not age. Routine had wrapped itself around my boots. I moved mile to mile with the thoughtless confidence that comes from doing the same honest work for so long it becomes a second skeleton. Memory is a trail that looks shorter on the map than underfoot. It rises when you go back, and the air thins. The kind of crisp autumn day when the forest felt alive with possibility and the air carried the promise of winter's approach. The canopy sifted light into cathedral dust. Squirrels drew quick arcs in the understory and vanished behind the roots of trees that outlived wars, droughts, and men like me. Santos was checking trail conditions along the lesser-used Mororo Rock backcountry routes, documenting fallen trees and erosion damage for the upcoming maintenance season. I recorded lean angles and undercuts, measured the slump of a washout with the tip of a boot, took photos because photos remember what language edits. The grove had the gravity of a long-held breath. I walked in it, cataloguing small harm in a place so big it made harm look like punctuation. By the time I reached a crescent of meadow that broke the red walls like a green lake, the camera on my chest held images of frost-heaved signs and wind-littered needles. Santos was photographing a damaged trail sign when something caught his eye on a nearby tree trunk. At first I filed it under fungi, those porcelain fans that bloom from dead wood in tidy colonies. Then the shape corrected itself and stood up in my brain. Nailed to the bark of an ancient sequoia, approximately 6 feet from the ground, was a human thumb. I didn't shout. Training says, you slow down when reality speeds up. I named the tools in my pack, named the steps in my head like a litany against panic. The appendage was secured to the tree with a single railroad spike driven through the base, pinning it against the reddish bark with deliberate precision. Whatever message this was, it had been written in a practiced hand. The forest tried to remain itself, light, resin, a low wind threaded through crowns. But my world had been edited. The thumb appeared fresh, showing no signs of decomposition despite being exposed to the elements. And the nail bed still retained traces of what appeared to be purple nail polish. The color was almost cheerful. I thought of someone painting it under a domestic light, a small human act that had no business at eye level in a temple of trees. I took the photos I did not want to take. labeled them aloud so my voice would replace the one that had begun, uninvited, to narrate what kind of person brings a part of another person this far into the quiet. I flagged the area and called it in. Measuring my breath between coordinates, the thumb was positioned at exactly eye level for an average height adult, suggesting that whoever had placed it wanted it to be found and noticed. That single detail felt like a hand on my shoulder. Whoever did this knew people, not just trees. They knew how a ranger walks, what a tourist sees, how a story gets told. If there was an alphabet here, I meant to learn it. When the call ended, the grove felt larger than it ever had, as if the sequoia had taken one step farther away from me while never moving at all. By the time the first pair of federal boots reached the tape, the day had thinned toward evening. We moved carefully because we owed the place that much. The spike looked old and careful, not like the zinc-bright hardware you buy by the bucket. Later, lab notes would confirm what my fingertips suspected. The railroad spike used to secure the thumb was traced to a batch manufactured in the 1940s. Investigation of the surrounding area revealed no additional evidence of human presence or activity. We widened our circles in the duff, preserving our own prints and finding nobody else's. The tree stood just as it had before we were born, hosting our concern the way it had hosted lightning, insects, and snow. That night, under headlamp, I wrote the incident report as if writing could turn chaos into clean lines, and words like apparent, unknown, and secured marched down the page. I did not write the word message, but it breathed behind every sentence, a shape in the dark just outside the beam. The next days taught me what federal attention feels like in a silent place. The murmur of radios, quiet faces, the choreography of people trained to touch nothing and see everything. They worked like surgeons around a heart nobody could name. Most disturbing was the condition of the severed digit, which showed signs of having been removed with surgical precision rather than torn or cut in a struggle. I am a ranger, not an agent, but questions accumulated over me like snowfall. Who chooses a living monument as a bulletin board? Who carries a part of someone cross-country and hangs it in a cathedral of wood and breath? Why a thumb? The vote of the body. The switch that says yes or no. Lab results refused to collapse the mystery into something manageable. I learned more about iron than I had ever cared to know. We examined the tool marks and the dark halos beneath the bark. Careful examination revealed multiple old puncture wounds in the same area, suggesting that this tree had been used for similar purposes before. It wasn't the first time a spike had entered this exact patch of living bark. That thought landed in me like a slow weight. Whoever did this had a relationship with the tree, with this location, with the idea of returning. We kept looking for the human trace we could comfort ourselves with. Careless prints, a dropped wrapper, a scuff in the humus. The forest floor showed no footprints, disturbed vegetation, or other signs that someone had recently visited the location. Investigation of the surrounding area revealed no additional evidence of human presence or activity. The absence of any trail leading to or from the tree made the placement of the thumb seem almost supernatural, as if it had appeared without any human intervention. I don't believe in that word. I believe in skill and patience, in the kind of fieldcraft that lets a person pass through big country as if carried by it. News travels in ranger country the way water finds downhill. Notes on this case reached other parks. Files that had slept for years got cracked open, and what rose from them was a pattern. Santos learned that similar discoveries had been made in other national parks across the western United States, always involving human body parts secured to trees with antique railroad spikes. The hair rose on my arms, though the temperature hadn't changed. My tree was not alone. My job was not either. Theories multiplied the way grass does after a small burn, green and everywhere. Ritual was a word I heard. So was message discipline. Others spoke of collectors who knew the history of rails better than their own birthdays. In none of it stuck to the bark the way sap did. I did what I have always done when I don't understand a place. I returned to it. I walked slow circles with my hands open at my sides. I watched the wound crust into amber, a jewel the tree made to survive our curiosity. Months passed without any additional discoveries or leads in the case. The spike endured like a black hyphen between two clauses the grove had not yet written. I learned the grain of the metal the way I had learned the grain of the wood around it. The thumb was eventually removed from the tree and stored as evidence, but the spike remained embedded in the bark as a permanent reminder of the incident. Agents came and went until they did not come at all. The tapes came down. The signs resumed their work, pointing hikers toward views they had hoped would cure whatever they carried up the hill. If you spend enough years alone among giants, you learn to measure yourself, not just against size, but against silence. After the thumb, silence thickened. Birds skirted the crown. Or maybe I only told myself that. Small mammals made detours that looked like respect or fear. Santos noticed that wildlife began avoiding the area around the tree, with birds refusing to nest in its branches and small mammals creating detours around its base. I wrote the line in my notebook and then in a memo. The memo felt like scratching at a door that would not open. I kept covering my district because work, done right, is its own shelter. My boots remembered where to step, even when sleep didn't. Then the second spike appeared. No flesh, no cloth. Just iron grinning out from a seam in the bark as if the tree had healed around a memory and decided to show it to me. A third surfaced at shoulder height in a burned scar, then another, low to the ground, where only a crawling child would see it. A systematic search revealed 17 other locations where antique railroad spikes had been driven into sequoia bark. Though none of these contained human remains, I marked them on maps, circled them like constellations that refused to make a picture. I told myself that metal without a body was progress, but metal carries intention more cleanly than blood does. It mirrors your face when you lean close and refuses to answer questions, and I kept my logs. My supervisor started calling it an assignment. Assignments turned into a loop that looked like my life from the outside and like insomnia from the inside. I tried counseling once, and I described stress as if it were an impersonal weather system crossing a map. The professional nodded. I nodded. I left early and walked the perimeter of a parking lot until the air cooled me down from remembering. Work, record, repair, respond. Those were the R's. I added read. I read about rails and their hardware and how a spike can become a collector's totem. I called historians who taught me how wartime batches differ from peacetime ones, how square shoulders and pitted shanks can tell a story as plain as a fingerprint. I asked botanists how many wounds a tree can hold before age hides violence. Some answered with patience, and others did not return my calls, and I learned enough to know what I still didn't know. Meanwhile, the official language remained calm as a memo pinned to a corkboard. The case officially remains open, classified as an ongoing federal investigation into criminal activity within national park boundaries. That sentence did not change holidays, didn't change how the weight of a hammer in my hand could throw me into a place I didn't want to go. I started leaving certain tools in the truck and carrying others for reasons I couldn't justify, except that they made me feel less exposed to something that had already found me once. The transfer form was short. The conversation was shorter. Santos eventually requested transfer to administrative duties, citing health concerns that prevented him from continuing fieldwork. The office taught me the muscle memory of email, the ritual of spreadsheets, the faint warmth of a printer cooling down. After hours, I still drove to trailheads without a uniform and let my feet remember who I had been. The forest did not shame me for leaving, but it didn't forgive me either. It just went on being immense in a way that made all my reasons sound smaller. I handed my replacement a binder as heavy as a newborn, filled with photographs nobody asked for and maps whose circles made patterns I refused to name. I did not tell him about the dreams, and I did not tell him how In low light, a spike can take on a glow like a coal pretending not to burn. The monitoring continued because monitoring is what agencies do when answers refuse to arrive. The tree where the thumb was discovered continues to be monitored, but no additional evidence has been found. The sequoia still stands, a column stitched to sky. The spike abides inside it the way a grudge abides inside a man. Quiet didn't end the correspondence because out of uniform. I wrote to a ranger in Utah about something he found in Pinon Country, to a biologist in Oregon about a nailhead she couldn't date, to a retired investigator in Arizona who followed a rumor into a stand of Ponderosa and came out carrying a story I wish I could forget. Santos learned that similar discoveries had been made in other national parks across the western United States, always involving human body parts secured to trees with antique railroad spikes. Not all stories live in government files. Some refuse the badge and still feel truer than anything stamped and scanned. I keep a private folder no one else will inherit. In it lies a truth I cannot articulate without pretending I know more than I do. It is not a conspiracy wall with yarn and pins. It is colder than that. It is a skill set married to patience. A willingness to turn a public room into a private theatre by hanging a single human note where anyone might find it. The case serves as a reminder that national parks, despite their reputation as places of natural beauty and peace, can harbour secrets as dark as any urban crime scene. Beauty is not innocence. Wilderness is not empty. Here is what remains on paper after the air has been let out of it. The case officially remains open, classified as an ongoing federal investigation into criminal activity within national park boundaries. Months passed without any additional discoveries or leads in the case. The investigation expanded to include missing person reports from across the region, but no matches were found for the thumb's owner. The forest floor showed no footprints, disturbed vegetation, or other signs that someone had recently visited the location. These lines, repeated enough times, start to sound like a catechism. They don't keep me from walking the loop in my head. The one that begins with a purple sheen and ends with a handful of iron that remembers a rail it never touched. I will die not knowing what. And on good days I accept that. On bad days. I picture a person I will never meet pausing at the edge of a meadow with a pack full of purpose and a mind quiet enough to work by headlamp without shaking. I picture them cutting clean and carrying quiet, choosing their routes with a tenderness that is the opposite of mercy. Then I make myself imagine them stopping because they heard a story like this one and decided that tonight belongs to some other tree, some other park. If there is a kindness in that thought, it is small and it is mine. I keep the photos in an envelope at the back of a drawer, keep my badge in the front so I see it whenever the wood slides open. A reminder that my job was to love land in a practical way. I still do. I love it enough to say, this part of it is not a postcard, and I love it enough to say, I've failed to bring one person home. I love it enough to stop pretending the woods are only gentle, as somewhere a spike waits in a garage, polished again. Somewhere a tree the size of a bell tower will be asked to hold a secret it never asked to keep. And somewhere a man who used to walk patrols looks up at a darkening ceiling and tells himself that the world is still good, and that the work of believing it is worth doing. Even when belief has to stand in the same room as fear. Story number 6. I was trained to follow every cry for help. No one trained me for hearing my own. The radio knew my name before anyone spoke it aloud, as in that white world. Even the pines looked like they were holding their breath. I tell visitors, the park is beautiful. I don't tell them it can learn you, echo you, feed you back to yourself. If you ever hear a child's plea where no footprints lead, turn around. I keep my park badge clipped where my hand finds it without looking. It's a little ritual that keeps larger mistakes from happening when the world goes pale and the air bites. The patrol began the way winter patrols often do, vacant lots, silent buildings, snowfields lying under a cold moon as if the planet had paused its pulse. Then the radio woke and a woman's voice flooded the cab. "Help us! Please help us!" The sentence was ordinary. The tone wasn't. It wasn't panic you hear on ski slopes or the brittle fear of a wrong trail. It was older, as if something had been practicing the word help until it learned to bruise it. I answered with my call sign and the habits drilled into me. The reply didn't come back as a conversation. It came back as a loop. We're lost and someone is hurt badly. We can see lights, but we can't reach them. Her vowels shook hard enough that I pictured her jaw shivering. A family, I thought, pushed off a spur by drifts. Headlights hazed, shoes soaked. The cold, stealing coordination. I told myself this was why I became a ranger, to put cold people back into warm rooms. I asked for landmarks, which slope, which bridge, which turnoff. Silence opened like a door to a room I couldn't see. And then the same lines returned, timed the same way, like a metronome set to grief. I told myself a transmitter might be damaged. I told myself repeaters can braid and make a single voice sound like a choir, even as I stacked neat reasons on an imaginary clipboard. My hands were already in motion, outer layer zipped, avalanche kit checked, headlamp tested. We can see lights was all it took for the world to become my responsibility. I radioed our desk, logged the call, rolled the truck into snow that muffled everything. Tires, heartbeat, thought. The signal grew as I left the last plowed spur and again when I eased past the sign most visitors love in summer. Another voice wove into the first, high, thin, refusing to be brave any longer. "Please. We've been walking for hours and we're so cold." I told the radio to wait for me. It was ridiculous and it helped. The valley gave me back nothing but whitened line and the slow sweep of wind. The first miles felt reasonable. Then the road narrowed under wind-laid ridges, and the bars on my handheld climbed like a dare. Every training says the same thing. Don't chase a signal into terrain that wants to fold you into it. Every story I carry about a night gone wrong began with a sensible excuse. The job is a covenant, but the park writes the fine print. The transmissions guided instead of replying. The same phrases were repeated with identical inflection and timing, as if she was hearing recordings rather than live communications. Duplicate packets, I told myself. A stuck key somewhere uphill. A headset wedged on transmit. But repetition is its own language. And this one spoke of pulling, not losing. I reached the barricade. Boards rhymed white. The winter boundary everyone learns to respect, and felt a tide beyond it. The voices led her to the going to the Sun Road, which was closed to vehicle traffic during winter months due to extreme avalanche danger and impassable snow conditions. The part of me that carries rules told me to stop. The part of me that carries people told me to keep going. I stepped out and let my boots test the crust. A ranger is a ledger of decisions, each adds weight to the next. I strapped on snowshoes, studied the chutes above, the cornices, the way wind drew lines across slabs. I told dispatch where I was going and that I would not be a hero. Then I went anyway. Duty is an arrow that doesn't ask whether the target is a mirror. The signal thickened as the canyon narrowed. The way fog densifies around a river bend, the words kept their shape even as the night hollowed them out. The transmissions grew stronger as she moved away from established roads and facilities. I saw a low pulse of light ahead, then lost it behind a bend made of stone and pine. The child's thin plea threaded the air again, and the part of me that became a ranger stepped forward before the rest of me could vote. We're lost. We can see lights. Snow accepted my weight with a soundless shrug. Above me, the high country watched, without blinking. Time rearranged itself into landmarks, a split-trunk spruce, a boulder like a sleeping buffalo. a drift with a crust you could write your name on. The woman's voice fractured and mended, describing worsening conditions and the deteriorating state of the injured person in their group. I named the rules in my head like prayers. Check the run-out. Read the pillowed snow. Stay off loaded faces. The radio's glow painted my glove a dim green. The signal needle was the only thing moving with confidence. I came around a bulge of rock and the sound hit me from the side. So close it grazed my cheek. I lifted the mic, said nothing. And then a sentence walked out of the speaker wearing my stride and my breath. It was her own voice, pleading desperately for rescue from somewhere in the darkness ahead. My voice. The mountain pressed its hand against my sternum. I didn't speak for a long moment. The radio did the speaking for me. It said my name the way I say it when I'm tired and trying to be calm. There are feelings your body knows before your mind agrees to name them. Mine knew I had walked into a hall of mirrors made of air. I listened again and there I was, saying words I hadn't said, speaking with an emotional intensity that perfectly matched the other distressed voices she'd been following. The practical part of me reached for likely causes, looped audio, pranked recordings, a ghost of a signal bouncing off ice. But cadence is intimate, and my own cadence held me still as a nailed boot. Another voice slid in, familiar as my morning briefings. The woman who had first called for help sounded exactly like her supervisor, Ranger Captain Sarah Morrison. Then a boy who should have been asleep in a city far away spoke between them. The child's voice belonged to her nephew, who lived hundreds of miles away and had never visited the park. I stood in the cut bank's shadow, hands stable because I forced them to be. I understood then that I wasn't walking toward people, I was walking toward a design. A predator doesn't have to have teeth, it only needs to know the shape of your mercy. I took one step back, then another. The radio narrowed its message, sharpening it like a blade. Elena, please don't leave us. You know you can save us. Why are you abandoning us when we need you most? The odd spelling tripped me. It was almost my name. The way a stranger might write it after reading it once. The breath behind the words was mine, and then hers, and then something without lungs at all. I marked the slope above me, the road below, the distance back to the safety of machines and other people. Every rescuer carries two compasses, one points north, the other points toward whoever sounds most hurt. I set the first upon my map and told the second to obey it. Turning around is a kind of rescue too. I said I was retreating, out loud, to remind myself that I had decided. The voices followed her, becoming more desperate and accusatory as she moved away from their source. They said I was condemning a family. They said the injured would not live without me. They said the child would learn what it feels like to be ignored. They knew how to load a sentence right where it would hurt. The mountain had been mountain until I met those voices. Now the land felt like a stage, and I was being walked to a mark I hadn't agreed to hit. I kept my head below the skyline, tested each step, measured my breathing in slow counts. Words tried to braid themselves into my fear. I let them pass through like wind through fence wire. The needle fell one bar, then another. Somewhere behind me, the design loosened its grip. When I reached the barricade again, the lowland air felt almost warm. The signal eased in the same way a distant road disappears when you crest a hill. The voices had finally faded as she moved away from the remote wilderness area, and yet the silence they left behind was louder than any plea. At the truck I noted coordinates, signal strengths, every dull fact that could be checked. Between those lines I wrote a promise to myself I would not walk alone toward that kind of sound again. Reports want reasons. I gave them the kind that leave careers intact. Interference, atmospherics, gear crosstalk. Investigation of the incident revealed no evidence of actual hikers in distress anywhere in the park. No missing persons, no footprints where there should have been footprints, no beacons arguing with my guilt. The radio equipment showed no signs of malfunction. Paper accepted my words without judgment. Sleep did not. I kept my sentences neat in the morning meetings. I drafted new pages in our binder. 3 ways to verify. 2 rangers minimum, a hard rule against solo pursuit into closed country. She developed protocols for verifying the authenticity of distress calls and insisted on backup for all wilderness rescue operations. I stopped signing up for night duty. I refused to feed the dreams that liked to dress in my uniform. Sometimes kindness is taking the pen away from your fear and handing it to daylight. But you can't work a place like this and pretend you're the only one special enough to be haunted. Research into similar incidents revealed a pattern of phantom distress calls reported by rangers and emergency responders across multiple national parks. The details matched like teeth. Voices of people you knew, routes that pulled responders into bad-angle country. Nothing at the end but deeper cold. None of us found bodies, and all of us found the quiet afterward harder to live with. Visitors ask me where to stand for the perfect photo. I point and talk about light. And I do not tell them what else the park can do with light. I moved to daytime work and learned to measure success by how many families go home with their toes warm. She continues to work in the park system, but has never returned to the remote areas where she encountered the phantom voices. Still, on certain nights, a radio on a shelf in the equipment cage comes alive and speaks like it has a mouth. No one touches it. We all listen anyway. There is a kind of wilderness that cares less about trails than patterns. If something out there has learned the shape of compassion and found it useful, then our training is a menu it has studied. I think about that whenever the wind redraws the same lines across old snow. What learns us can unmake us if we let it choose the terms. So listen. If a voice tells you what you are built to hear but cannot tell you where it is, weigh your mercy against your map. If the signal grows stronger the farther you are from help. Ask who benefits from your distance. If a familiar voice calls your name with one letter wrong, remember that your body, not your fear, knows the slope angle that will slide under you, and current protocols require verification of all distress calls through multiple channels before initiating response. I wrote those words. I meant them. I live by them now. And if you cannot resist the pull, bring another heartbeat whose compass can argue with yours. Keep the line open. Keep your steps deliberate, and refuse to let the dark decide who you are. The voices continue to call, waiting for the next compassionate ranger, not to praise courage, but to test its edges. I have stood at the gate and heard what wears my voice like a mask. I turned back. I am here to say something plain. Some rescues are traps that want your bravery more than your presence. No one was missing. No one was there. The calls still come when the sky is hardest. I practice my answer in case my resolve is thin. I say my name exactly the way I mean it. State my location twice. I ask for a landmark only a real boot would notice. When nothing true returns, I go where my truck will start again. The peaks are still there at first light. The living still need us. But mercy is not obedience. Mercy is choosing the rescue that returns you to rescue again. Story number 7. I was trained to find the living and count the lost, but the circle taught me another arithmetic, subtraction without an end. Maps never warned me about places that edit themselves out of the world. I have seen cliffs take men, rivers take memory, and storms take sense. The clearing took something else, permission. I told the rookies to keep their helmets on, but nothing fits over a thought that won't stop growing. If you ever step into a place where even birds edit their flight, turn around before the silence finishes your name. I have worked the high country long enough to know the difference between a problem and an instruction from the land. When the message about the missing botanist reached our office, it read like every other field alert. Solo researcher overdue. Known route, good weather, competent in the mountains. My job was to stack facts until a pattern showed its face. I pulled the team together, ran the plan twice, then drove the rutted service road until the forest swallowed the last bar of reception. I kept my voice steady because that tone is a rope in other people's hands. Her name sat on the form like a dry leaf. light and uninterfering. The kind you can blow off a desk with a sigh, a professor who mapped the high communities of alpine plants. A person like that notices boundaries the way a tracker notices pressure ridges, by touch, by patience, by the way absence behaves. The route permit traced a thin wire through the Mummy Range, then bent toward an old research site near Timberline. Snowfields were elsewhere. Storms had wandered away. The day was clean. It should have been boring, which is how a ranger spells safe. We started at her last logged plot. The elevation took its quiet tax. Lungs burn a little, calves argue, and the mind walks at the speed of breath. My partner checked the cairns. I listened for what wasn't there. The forest carried its usual music, needles speaking to wind, a creek rehearsing old lines among stones, flies practicing their insistence. I told myself to trust routine. Routine is the bridge between strangers. We fanned out. Radios on our shoulders, leashes in the handlers' hands, and the dogs ahead. Noses threading scent from the ground's loose fabric. One of the handlers raised his palm. The dogs balked, not alarm, not fatigue, but refusal. I know the minimal grammar of a working animal, the forward lean that means yes, the planted feet that pronounce no. They tugged left, not toward a trail or a water source, but into a block of trees woven tight enough to hang a coat. We followed. The understory thickened, then fell away at once. And my boot found a surface that felt wrong in the most ordinary way. I looked up. The place would have been beautiful if it had allowed a single form of life. It was perfectly circular, more exact than anything made by hand in the backcountry. The border, so clean it looked etched. I paced it later with a tape, and a mouth I had to remind to close, 60 feet in diameter. The edge drawn as though by a compass, pressed into the earth by a patient god. Inside, nothing. No moss, no grass, no humble volunteer of a seed with ambition. The ground was raw and intimate, not dead dirt, not scorched, not poisoned. My botanist on the team knelt, sifted a fistful, smelled it, frowned. She called the soil healthy and fertile, then kept glancing at the perimeter as if it might blink. Plants along the margin behaved like citizens at a polite border. They advanced and then would not cross. Their roots clutching a lip of earth, as if clutching a railing above a drop. The edge looked like a law drawn with ink that never dried. It was the wrong kind of neat. A soldier would have called it a killing ground. A surveyor would have called it a marvel. I called it a problem that arranged itself as a sentence with no verb. We ran the basic tests, not because we trusted them, but because that is our religion. We photographed the boundary, staked flags at compass points, logged coordinates. We made jokes our families would not repeat. The botanist told me to listen. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I realized what I was hearing was not. The wind hit the pine crowns and lost interest at the fence of leaves. The creek lost volume until it was a rumor. No insects, no wing flick. We had stepped into a throat that declined to vibrate. I asked the team to hold the line while I walked the center. I have built my life around walking into what everyone else circles. The ground bore no prints, not human, not elk, not fox, not anything with weight or intention. The sun laid itself down without heat. I reached the exact middle by pacing triangles, a method I trust when trust thins. That was when geometry turned into inventory. Someone had been leaving offerings here, or perhaps the clearing grew its own altar. At the center lay a display arranged with a meticulousness that made my skin forget its job. I have found wallets before, backpacks scattered by weather, gloves near a fall line. This was not that. Here the objects arranged themselves into order, unnervingly deliberate, like a museum curated by an absence with exacting taste. In a spiral pattern so precise that each arc mirrored the last. There lay personal belongings from lives that had galloped in from different years and never galloped out again. Hiking boots faced as if waiting for their feet to return. Stoves nested with canisters as if obeying an invisible quartermaster. Tags, permits, a scatter of bandanas. A brass whistle. A compass whose needle seemed calm for the first time in its career. Names existed here, stitched into hats, scribbled onto the backs of photographs, etched on metal mugs by people who believed in coming home. In one pocket-worn billfold I found driver's licenses. In a dry pouch, a stack of credit cards, each time stamped by design. Each unhelpful about the present. The oddity sharpened. The leather wasn't cracked. The nylon hadn't gone powdery. The plastic hadn't paled. There were no signs of weathering. If the mountain had kept a dry museum, this was its climate-controlled gallery. At the farthest sweep of the spiral, a field notebook waited. Stained only by the oil of its owner's attention, a GPS lay beside it. Screen dark. Its last coordinates captured by the log already in my hand. The notes told a story of boundaries and patience, measurements, sketches of leaf forms, soil pH, thoughts about patterns that had no right to exist. The final pages shifted tone. Observations gave way to admissions. The writer confessed to feeling observed, then described a pull to remain, a soft, unreasonable invitation to stay past any plan, when the voice in ink began to sound like the voice in my head. I closed the book. The team put down flags and took up quiet. We photographed the spiral and logged each item with the kind of seriousness you reserve for placing a hand on a shoulder. A handler set cameras around the ring of trees. Another measured the circle again. 45 minutes passed, or maybe not. In places like this, time loses noun status. My botanist tested the edge with seedlings from her kit. Each little stem leaned toward the interior, as if curious, reached with a confidence too new to have learned fear, and then stopped. Roots tasting a boundary their leaves couldn't see. We watched a line of ants approach, then fail to arrive. Their column bending to skirt the circle as if it were a puddle of logic. The dogs refused to cross. One lay down with its head on its paws, a gesture of work withdrawn. I told myself it was the pack of our scent that troubled them, that my voice sounded wrong, that something in my posture argued against their training. Lies are tools we buy with the coin of our better judgment. They usually spend fast. Protocol demanded we treat what we had found as evidence. That meant calling in people who specialized in the kinds of questions that end with a court date. I made the call. The dispatcher's receipts of my words thinned at the edges. Between you can't file a report that reads, "The forest stepped aside and showed us a mind." They arrived with cases that clicked, lenses that saw in more spectrum than our eyes, scanners that peered into dirt the way medics peer into chests. I stood by with a pencil like a priest who had forgotten his liturgy. The technicians whispered to the clearing without stepping into it. Then they did step in, because work has its own courage. Wands swept, heads bent, readouts frowned. The ground answered with the plainest ground penetrating radar could ask for. No buried remains, no chambers, no voids, no disturbance more consequential than a pocket gopher's daydream. If someone had used this place as a theater of harm, they had erased the stage with a discipline that insulted the idea of hands up. We ran swabs we suspected would be boring. They were. Soil chemistry matched the forest's pantry. The pH smiled politely. Metal traces did not spike. Radiation whispered its ordinary lullaby. Our prints booted up on the interior, but nothing else did. We dusted for grief and found none. We begged for a mistake because mistakes are the handholds of investigation. The plane of absence of any physical evidence lay so clean that it reflected our own faces back at us. The biologists needed to set their own questions loose. They flagged trails just beyond the green wall, then fixed cameras at intervals that turned the perimeter into a clock. Days accumulated like unspent letters, the record filled with elk shoulder-deep in meadow, with fox slipping past like a rumor, with pine marten darning the underbrush. Then the lens stared into the clearing and saw nothing, because nothing entered. Animals avoided the area completely. Not one deer toe, not one curious jay, not the low clatter of a beetle having its day. The tapes of this kind of nothing make a new species of noise. More than once I woke and saw the zone of complete biological silence with my eyes closed. The team lost its appetite for standing alone in the interior. That kind of reluctance rarely admits itself out loud. It shows up as someone suddenly very intent on finding batteries. Someone else recalling a task that can wait outside the line. The mind grows tired faster than the legs and betrays itself with errands. I kept walking to the center because that was the job, and because I had begun to resent the circle's calm, and it sat there like an argument that always wins because it refuses to engage. My botanist measured again and again at made. The tape told a tale we didn't ask for. The border was expanding at a rate of approximately 1 in per month. The circle was growing like an idea that re-explains itself to gain permission. We took photographs from fixed points. The flags marched outward so slowly, a casual eye would have missed the drift. We are trained to love slow processes, the way glaciers write valleys, the way tree rings add a whispered arithmetic to a trunk. But this rhythm felt like theft with patience. At night, I inventoried what lived in my pack and tried not to inventory what lived in my head. A place that says no to plants and animals and insects and birds does not need to shout to say it to people. The notebook I had read, with its perfect graphs and its increasingly unsteady handwriting, returned to me. The writer had described a longing to sit in the center and let the day walk around. I had felt that too. You could call it professional curiosity, the kind that makes people end their lives on the right side of a cornice because they wanted to see if the snow would hold. But this was not curiosity. This was a voice flavored like relief. That was the day I locked my radio on transmit long enough to prove to myself I still preferred company. The clearing was closed to visitors with the kind of signage that doesn't explain itself. We moved the flagging tape farther out and taught new crew members how to read an order before they read the terrain. Word traveled through the back country the way it always does, along the braid of gossip and common sense. Experienced hikers adjusted their routes without complaining. Hunters detoured. The old-timers who drink coffee at dawn and manage local weather by deciding what to talk about stopped talking about this altogether. You learn to recognize the way a community respects a boundary by not asking for stories that want to be left alone. The spiral remained impeccable. From time to time, the cameras registered a new object at the outer ring, a hat, a cracked phone in a waterproof bag, a carabiner that had known 1,000 gates, and we never caught the moment of addition. The lens blinked, and the now had been revised. We would step in, log the newcomer, and place it back exactly where we found it. As though we understood the etiquette here, that my palms warmed each time I handled a relic. Do not use the word sacred often because I know how to count, but there are arrangements that wear that word without asking. I did not return there alone after I realized the center had measure of me. The place remembered the exact weight of my steps and the cadence of my thinking. I felt it when I fell quiet in my truck, and when I ran a hand over maps pinholed by years of routes. It doesn't matter whether that feeling was true. In the high country, enough belief becomes weather. We built procedures to keep us honest, document oddities, do not linger at edges that won't accept tracks, pair up near anomalies, log the felt as carefully as the scene. People smiled at that last rule until they stood at the clearing's border and recognized that the body is an instrument living in a bag called a person. It offers readings your education may try to audit. We wrote those readings down anyway. The mountain doesn't care what you call the truth. It cares whether you know how to carry it without dropping your partner. I kept the notebook under glass in the office when I wasn't transferring its data to people who prefer numbers to nouns. The final paragraphs waited for me when the station went quiet. The writer's sentences grew shorter, then wider, then surrendered, punctuation in places. She wrote of counting her own breaths, of matching them to the circle's radius, of thinking the word home until the word no longer showed her a door. She wrote of hearing a step that did not belong to her, then apologized on the next line for indulging the fiction. I closed the cover each time with 2 fingers like a medic closing a patient's eyes. It was not respect, it was self-defense. The cameras send their emptiness on schedule. The botanist sends graphs that chart the border's growth with all the drama of a slow clock. The clearing keeps its tone of mild rebuke and has returned to us that we can hold in a hand and say, here is your answer. The mountain has its share of crimes. This does not feel like one. Crimes are made by people, and people reveal themselves by accident. This feels like a grammar problem written by a place, a rule we do not yet know how to obey. I still work the high country. I still coach rookies on how to listen for a lost person's name in the wind. I still know how to tell spouses what to do with their hands. And I still promise what I'm sure of, that we will walk all the way in and all the way out again. I say those words and mean them. I do not tell them what we learned at the ring of trees, that some distances have no downhill, that some perimeters are not for crossing in either direction. I drive past the turnoff now without thinking about it, most days. On other days, I pull in and sit with the truck off and the windows down, letting everything that is not the clearing restore itself to volume. I do not get out. The edge does not need me to pace it. It already knows my measure. When the wind combs the pines, it breaks and bends around what it refuses to enter. And I imagine the day the line will reach the road. And that is a day for a different sort of arithmetic. And that is a day for someone else to name. Some places do not end when you leave them. They begin when you test whether you can. I kept telling myself that avoidance is not a strategy, that a ranger who will not re-enter a site is a ranger whose knees now decide policy. One night, clear air, swollen moon, stars crisp enough to touch without consequence, I parked at the service gate and walked in with my headlamp off. The woods know the trespass of artificial light. I did not want to announce a single lumen. The road remembered every rut. My boots found them without argument. By the time the trees thinned, I had already promised myself twice that I would stop at the tape. Promises made to yourself in the dark are bargains with a lawyer who represents both parties. The perimeter caught the moon and disciplined it. The bright edge traced the circle like a rule that had been signed by the night itself. I stood outside the line, counted breaths, rehearsed good reasons to leave, and then stepped in. Nobody changes announcement in a place like that. The changes are quiet, administrative. My shoulders lowered a fraction. My thoughts arranged themselves in columns. The noisy collage of a day in the field became a ledger of simple entries. The silence was not empty, it was organized. I felt seen, but not watched. The way you feel when a form asks for your middle name. I walked the spiral, logging items with a pencil I had snapped in half before I entered, so that I could not write too long. A camping mug scratched 3 letters into its own belly. A bandana folded itself the way a square wants to be folded. A canister stove stood closed and content. At the outermost curl, I found something that did not belong to the Museum of Loss. My own field tag. The laminated card I had replaced last season when rain took the ink from the old one. It lay there as if it had always been on that ground, as if my name were a species in a collection. I looked up so fast the world lagged a beat. My pockets remembered their inventory. The replacement tag was present against my chest. Both were real, the new one warm with my heat, the old one with a scuff I recognized from a flint-faced boulder above Fern Lake. I did not touch the one at my feet. I catalogued it with my voice. A whisper that had no place here and therefore seemed louder than policy allows. The circle was not only keeping a record, it was keeping options. I closed my eyes and tested the want that sat in my ribcage. It did not want sleep or rescue or confession. It wanted rest from choosing. In the center of the clearing, the world presented itself without possibility. The absence of insects and birds and small life meant no interruptions. The absence of plants meant no clutter. The absence of weather in everything but temperature meant no surprises. If you have ever been asked to decide between two goods and two harms at the same time, you know the exhaustion this quiet answers. I began to count steps to fix the moment to the map in my head. The count failed at 10. Numbers do not repeat here, they drift. I backed out by memory of the trees and the shape of the sky. At the edge, the world resumed its necessary riot. I lifted the radio, felt its weight with relief, spoke to no one, and listened to the forest rehearse being alive. In the office the next morning, I opened the glass case and stared at the notebook. It had not moved. Of course it had not moved. That is not how hauntings work in places that refuse theatrics. I copied a paragraph in a careful hand. The way you copy a spell because you do not believe in spells but do believe in accuracy. The paragraph did not read as fear. It read as consent. I closed the cover and locked the case, precisely to perform the ritual of stopping. The ritual helped for an hour. That afternoon, we refit perimeter cameras with new batteries and changed their angles by degrees. The frames looked back at the same vacancy. I signed the chain of custody log as if I was signing for a package that contained my own future. Then ordered dinner for the crew and pretended to care about ordinary appetites. I excused myself and stepped outside when my fork grew heavy. The mountains wore their usual indifference. The sky wore its usual theater. The road wore its usual route toward the gate. I did not drive that way. You learn, as you age in the work, that not all enlargements are visible. Some live in policy, in what we no longer attempt, in the jokes we stop telling. The clearing's border moved in ways a graph can love. The rest of the expansion happened in us. Rookies who heard the briefing learned the new sentence at the end. If you encounter geometry where biology should be, withdraw. Veterans taught their knees to obey. The botanist took her measurements until the lines of her charts described an education. A slope that did not steepen. A progression that did not argue. The slow, sure migration of a law. We ran computer models to see how long until the perimeter met the service road, the trailhead, the first fence line of the valley. The models were extravagantly calm. A year is a loud thing in the city. In the mountains, it can be part of a single afternoon. The numbers said we had time. Numbers also said we are not always the creatures who set the clock. I stood with a map and a pencil and placed neat dots where we had logged similar reports in other districts, small anomalies people had walked out of with their names intact and their stories unfriendly to microphones. A circle where a lake refused to ripple. A meadow where ice took the shape of ribs on a noon in summer. A granite face cut with lines too straight to be the Earth's. Too random to be ours. The dots did not make a constellation, they made a study guide. The files we labeled, closed, acquired a new drawer, not closed, monitored. Inside, we placed what we could not fold into cause, evidence that would not confess. Absences that had memorized their own alibis, the underlined phrases in statements that sounded less like description and more like a place using a person to write down its behavior. I understood that we wanted a perpetrator because punishment is a clean kind of full stop. The clearing offered no subject to arrest, it offered a border. On a day that allowed for it, I returned with the botanist and the handler who had first raised his palm. We did not speak on the walk in. The clearing does not reward narration. At the edge we stopped and did the work like we were afraid to do it well. Runtime tests, photographs, small cores studied by a person who can read soil the way a musician reads a score. The results disobeyed our plot for drama, and everything was ordinary except the one thing that was not, and the one thing that was not remained elegant. polite, continuous. The handler set one last camera with the lens sighted low across the ground, as if to catch the footfall of a rabbit that did not believe in circles. Weeks later, that camera delivered frames that rearranged the furniture in my head. The images showed the spiral at dawn and then an absence that wasn't blank. It was a distortion, the size and shape of a standing person. Heat without body, body without heat, occupying the center, then gone. Nothing else in the shot moved. We tried to break the artifact with software. The artifact refused responsibility and therefore refused to be a fault. I printed the frame and taped it above my desk. Exactly because it did not help. We built a fence at a distance far enough out that the fence did not pretend it could prevent anything. The signs used plain words because poetry gets you hurt. Area closed. Natural hazard. Do not enter. We posted the order and then posted ourselves and watched the graceful ways people can obey when they feel a rule is not about power, but about proportion. Those who came to argue, left with their voices lowered. Those who came to dare, left with their eyes busy on the path. A few stood long at the tape, as if listening to a sermon in a language they did not speak but had chosen to respect. I have been asked if I believe the clearing is dangerous. I say no, because danger lives in outcomes. The clearing lives in invitations. It invites you to surrender your adjustments. It invites you to play dead while standing up. It invites you to accept a version of quiet that does not include you. That is not harm, not exactly. That is relief grown in a soil that refuses roots. The future keeps its hands in its pockets when it walks past our outpost. I do not know what the line will touch when it grows. I only know the feeling it will produce when it does, a correction, like a teacher's mark at the margin of a page. I sign off the radio at shift's end and sit at my desk until the room cools. And I read the log entries that say nothing changed today in a way that changes me again. I have stopped asking the mountain for meaning. Mountains do not make promises. They enforce grammar. Now in that spirit, I enforce mine. We will walk in when called. We will walk out when told. And when a boundary writes itself with a hand steadier than ours, we will read it. And we will pass the lesson along without pretending we invented it.
If you go, do not take a souvenir. If you stay, do not call it staying. If you leave, do not tell yourself you won.
Story number 8. I went into Denali to count caribou and came back counting versions of myself.
A man stepped out of the spruce and wore my face. He smiled the way I do when I am lying to myself.
He knew the name I say for the woman I love and the fears I never say out loud. If identity is a trail, mine split that day. One path led forward, the other doubled back wearing my boots. This is the record I keep because I cannot trust any other witness to be me.
I tell this in the first person because any other perspective feels like surrender. My badge says Ranger. But out there, the land is the only authority. And it does not sign the paperwork I file. I walked the braided paths along Savage River, taking notes on tracks, scat, ice-hardened ruts, the things that prove a creature has passed and a season is changing. I had made a life out of measuring signs, and I trusted those signs more than I trusted my own moods. The air smelled of stone and lichens and the bite of cold water. The plain stretched with its low light and its honest distances, a kind of page that refuses to take a lie. I felt calm, the way you feel when a task matches the exact shape of your skills.
Ranger Thomas Kellerman had been patrolling the remote sections of Denali National Park for 6 years when he encountered something that would shatter his understanding of identity and reality forever. Those words belong to a report I never filed, a sentence I keep copying into the margins and then striking out, as if scratching it thin will make it less true. Kellerman was conducting a routine wildlife survey along the Savage River area, documenting animal populations and checking trail conditions before the harsh winter months made the back country inaccessible. That is the official muscle memory, speaking, locate, observe, record, I can recite that cadence in my sleep. It used to be enough. I was following a game trail, narrow and polite, when the trees arranged themselves into a frame and another ranger stepped into it. Not just any ranger, my height, my posture, the peculiar way I rest one hand on my belt to ease an old bruise from a fall years ago, the exact pattern of wear on the leather, the notch on the radio antenna where a wolf once mouthed it and let go. The individual was dressed in an identical park ranger uniform, complete with the same equipment and gear that Kellerman carried. The wind paused as if to listen. Or maybe it only felt that way because my attention had tightened to a point. He spoke first, my mouth working from across the clearing. "Beautiful morning for a survey, isn't it, Tom?" The nickname laid itself across my nerves like thin ice. I know what I sound like when I try for friendly in a place that demands restraint. That was it exactly. The animal part of me wanted distance. But the trained part made me answer as if this were a normal contact. Check credentials. Establish purpose. Confirm assignments. Only there was nothing to confirm because my schedule held no one but me. And the radio had been quiet all morning. He drifted closer until the small scar on his left hand, mine, caught the light. There are details you forget until a stranger shows them to you. My own face, the one I scraped clean without ceremony, looked back with a quiet competence I have worked years to earn. The resemblance was simple and total. The way a reflection is total when the water is perfectly still. He was looking at himself. Standing 30 feet away in the Alaskan wilderness, I wanted to blink and wake into a version of the day that did not include this, but the day refused the edit. He started talking about the herd I had trailed at dawn, naming the ridgeline where they angled east and the newborn with the uneven gait. He asked how my mother was doing after the latest test results, and whether Sarah's student finished the thesis that had kept them both on the phone past midnight. "You're wondering how I know about your conversation with Sarah last night," he said, patient as a physician. Then added a detail I had not said aloud to anyone. "About the ring you've been carrying in your pack for 3 weeks. Waiting for the right moment, he did not ask for permission to know me. He wore my life as if it were issued. My training said, radio, back up, document. My body said, this will unmake you." He smiled with my teeth. "Don't bother calling dispatch, Tom. They won't believe you anyway. How do you explain encountering yourself in the wilderness?" He let the silence after his question do more work than the question. The duplicate's logic was sound and deeply disturbing. I felt the urge to catalogue everything. The temperature of the air, the exact latitude, the sequence of words spoken, as if data could pin a butterfly. I did not believe it. I asked him what he wanted, because when an impossible thing speaks plainly, you must ask it to keep speaking. He looked at me the way I look at a trail camera I intend to move, professional, inquisitive, a little possessive. He told me he had been studying my routes, my habits, my schedule changes when storms rolled in, the way I returned to the same overlook when I needed to reset my pulse. He said he found my life efficient and well-made, like a pack, with no wasted straps. Then he told me the part that turned the ground slippery beneath my feet. I want your life, Tom, your job, your girlfriend, your family, your entire existence. He said it like a fact he was tired of keeping to himself. I want to be you completely and permanently. Like, what could I say that I had not already said internally during nights when doubt made small edits to my future? I told him that identity is not a uniform you can sign for and keep. It is the accumulation of scars and promises, of mistakes that make you learn new routes through the same terrain. He listened with more interest than I deserved. Then he laid out evidence. He recalled my childhood in Montana with its hay bales and brittle winters. He named a professor who told me I should choose birds over mammals because birds would forgive my clumsy mistakes. He quoted a joke my father told only once. "I know everything about you, Tom, every memory, every relationship, every detail of your life." The precision of it scraped the inside of my ribs. He explained that he did not intend harm, only replacement. A clean handover, like swapping a trail sign that weather had dulled for one that gleamed. He said there would be no disruption, that my friends and family would be spared grief, that work would continue smoothly under the same name. He said the only sufferer would be me, and only briefly, because absence suffers only at the edges before it becomes smooth. He spoke of me as if I were a territory to be managed. I asked him if he was human. He asked me if that mattered. He tilted his head, my habit when considering whether to take a side path. I put a hand on my sidearm, not to draw, but to remind myself I still inhabited a body. His eyes tracked the movement with no alarm. Violence won't solve this problem. Tomika, you can't shoot yourself, can you? The phrase was not taunt, but calculus toms. He did not step closer. He did not lunge. He simply let inevitability circulate until it tasted like air. So I asked for terms, because even losing can be managed. He offered them like a menu. I'll give you a choice, Tom. You can walk away from this encounter and pretend it never happened. He paused long enough for the idea to take shape. Or you can accept the inevitable now and make this transition easier for both of us. The gentleness in his voice insulted me more than threat would have. Choices are a way of organizing fear. I chose to convert fear into movement. I ran, not headlong, not careless, just with the controlled urgency of someone who knows the ground and knows how easily a misstep punishes pride. I set my weight where moss held and skirted roots that waited like questions. Behind me, I heard nothing. Still, his words stayed in the air the way cold stays in stone. You can't run from yourself forever, Tom. I am you and you are me. And eventually, we'll have to resolve this. The sentence followed me because the mind carries what it cannot set down. I put a mile between us. Then two. Then bent against a boulder to count my breath and count my options. Nothing in the clearing moved but memory. When the forest resumed its ordinary dignity, I tried to tell myself the story of a temporary break. Hard country can warp your sense of proportion. Solitude can polish anxieties into obsessions. I wore that explanation like a jacket that does not quite match your shoulders. Then I checked the tangible. The forest was silent except for the normal sounds of wildlife and wind through the trees. My GPS showed a block of missing time. More than an hour braided into a single point. His GPS device showed that he'd spent over an hour in the location where he'd met the duplicate. My radio sat on a channel I never use, and the pages of my notebook contained my handwriting performing observations I did not remember making. The facts stood together without apology. I finished the route. I put my observations into the system with a steadiness I envied, and I drove back to the station and signed the ledger the way we all do. The ritual that says the day had a shape. I did not file the other report. How to phrase it without sounding like a story told for effect. I was not interested in effect. I wanted containment. I told myself that 3 nights of decent sleep would reset the dials. What reset instead was my trust that I was the only one occupying my life. At home, the problem did not shrink. Distance from the spruce just stretched it like wire, and I found new routes to the same stores, new schedules for the same chores. He became paranoid about his personal security, changing his routines and avoiding predictable patterns that the duplicate might use to track him. I watched windows at angles. I read the faces of colleagues for signs that someone had already told them a secret in my voice. I answered Sarah with warmth that did not land because my attention kept splitting. I wanted to tell her everything. I could not teach my mouth how to ask for help in a language that would not make me sound unwell. I began to speak in the plural to myself, catching the habit and correcting it with a tired kind of humor I did not enjoy. I trained myself out of it, then caught myself again tracing the outline of someone else's shadow on the wall. When I finally took the ring out and set it on the table, it made a small circle of light that looked like a door you could put your finger through. I told myself I would ask when I could offer myself without cautions. The days made their slow climb and came back down again. Months passed without any sign of the duplicate, but Kellerman never stopped feeling like he was being watched and studied. When relief came, it came as a thought that I might have imagined it and that what I had taken as evidence was normal error reshaped by fear. But then I found trail camera footage of me walking a ridge I had not visited in weeks. My gait measured, my shoulders relaxed, my face turned toward a view I would have admired if I had been there. The timestamp did its neutral work. I stood very still, as if stillness could be proof of innocence. I applied for a transfer. The reason box does not have room for metaphysics, so I wrote that I needed a change of terrain. Denali had taught me as much as it could. That is how I framed it. In truth, I was leaving a mirror behind because I did not know how to darken the glass. He never returned to Denali, but he also never stopped looking over his shoulder. The new park was milder in its elevations and efficient in its systems. People smiled more and the storms were gentler. I learned the map fast and kept my back against walls more often than before. Sarah could tell something in me had shifted. She did not push. She asked, with the kind of kindness that makes refusal feel like theft. I told her a version that emphasized fatigue and the way a long season can dull a person's edges. She accepted the explanation because accepting is one way of loving. I did not tell her that when I held her hand, a small part of me scanned for counterfeit seams, that the smallest mismatches in memory felt like evidence. I hated that thought. I refused it daily. Refusal is not the same as cure. When the letters started arriving, the first one looked like a simple mistake, a postcard from a tourist who thanked me by name for recommending a viewpoint I had never mentioned. The second was a folded sheet with coordinates and no sender. The third was a photograph of my truck parked beside a trail sign I had never visited, the angle chosen by a person who knew my habits as a photographer. The fourth was a receipt for a dinner I had not eaten with a note in my handwriting correcting a misspelled species. The handwriting was mine, the way a signature is a face. The fifth letter came under my door as if the door itself had learned a new task. Inside, a single line copied from the note I did not file months before. The encounter serves as a disturbing reminder that some mysteries in the wilderness challenge not just our understanding of the natural world, but our very sense of self and identity. Below it, in smaller print in the same hand, I am making sure you keep good records. There was a courtesy to the phrasing that made my skin try to leave. I stopped checking trail cameras at dusk. I stopped lingering near reflective glass after dark. I told myself that ordinary life is a stronger ritual than fear. The ritual worked until a morning when I opened my locker and found my notebook. The old one with the stains and the hairline tear along the spine, inside, in my hand. And sometimes we encounter things that force us to question everything we thought we knew about ourselves. I closed the cover and set it back, then took a photograph of it, as if proof could outrun doubt. So what story do I offer you, listener, who may be a future me auditing this account for inconsistencies? A ghost story without a ghost, a crime without a body, a theft slowed into correspondence. I live, which means I lost nothing essential yet, or that I lost something so thoroughly I can no longer name the loss. I keep watch, which means I have accepted a duty I did not apply for. If there is a moral, it is provisional. Identity is not a solitary achievement. It is a contract renewed with the people who speak your name and mean it. I keep a copy of the sentences that do not belong to me pinned inside the lid of a metal box. They are ballast. They prevent me from floating away into denial. I read them aloud sometimes, to remind myself that the outline of my life has been traced by more than one hand. It was a cold September morning in 2019 with the Alaskan wilderness displaying its autumn colors and brilliant reds and golds across the vast tundra landscape. I keep that one because it is beautiful and cold and wrong, because time should not be able to put its fingers in the same glove twice and call it coincidence. Sometimes I rehearse what I will do if the mirror walks through a door again. I picture asking better questions, not why me, but how precise the copying is. Does he carry the ache in my knee when the weather turns? Does he know the exact weight of grief I carry for a friend from fire season? Does he remember the first owl I identified by call before I saw it? I know better than to expect mercy from want. I know better than to offer permission through politeness. If he arrives, I will not narrate the meeting for him. I will not supply the lines he prefers. On the worst nights, I imagine he already succeeded, and the version telling you this is the understudy, faithful enough to pass inspection but carrying a seam of doubt under the tongue. That thought has the power to rewrite a morning. I meet it with simple acts that no imposter would choose. I call my mother and ask for a memory only I would have. I ask Sarah a question too specific for a copy to improvise. I recite the serial number of a knife my father gave me and then check it against the steel. I choose one small habit each day that would be impossible for a stranger to guess. I turn my life into a series of locks whose keys are stories no one else lived.
What I know is this: my life is not a uniform. It is a living ecosystem of habits, aches, promises, and names spoken by people who will notice if they ring in a different register. If I ever disappear, the absence will not be smooth. There will be edges. And if you ever find yourself in a place so vast that your name comes back to you in a voice perfectly yours, remember that the land has room for more than one of anything, including lives. The question is whether you will protect the one you are carrying.
Before I close this, I will copy the fragments one last time to leave them where anyone who audits this file will find them and understand the stakes. And the duplicate continued the conversation as if nothing unusual was happening, discussing the weather, the caribou herd they'd both been tracking, and the upcoming winter preparations. This must be quite disturbing for you, meeting yourself like this. Having your understanding of reality challenged so fundamentally, I imagine you're questioning your sanity, wondering if you're having some kind of breakdown. If you are reading this because you found the box and opened it with my name, treat these words as coordinates. They do not mark a destination, they mark a boundary. And if the one who watches is reading, I am not an appointment you can walk into. I am a country with weather and tide and animal law. Entry requires more than likeness, it requires consent. Story number 9. I thought I knew the Smokies until the ground learned my name. Not a whisper from the trees, Ispal, not an animal call, only a pulse underfoot or counting to 3. Again and again. When the soil lit into a breathing ring around my tent, I finally understood that the forest had a face, and it wasn't looking up. In old reports I once filed and forgot, I learned that you can mistake fear for wind, you cannot mistake a rhythm for chance. If I tell you what rose from below, you may never pitch a tent again, yet silence is how the drums choose their next listener. I'm Marcus Webb, a ranger who stayed on these ridgelines long enough to memorize the scars on my boots and the smells that tell you which weather has already crossed the state line. Visitors know the overlooks, the postcard elk, the sugar maple glow that stops traffic. I know where sound goes to hide. I also know the one valley where sound refuses to bury itself, where it climbs back into your chest and insists on being counted. I never meant to chase mysteries. My job was simple as a creed: keep people safe, watch for smoke before it learns to rise, warn hikers before luck runs thin. The stories found me anyway, carried in by clean-souled backpackers who knew the difference between wind in the crowns and something that does not care about leaves at all. Their maps were folded to the same crease. Their voices shared a fragile certainty I recognized from first responders. The certainty of having met a thing and not wanting to name it. I wrote as they spoke. I kept the names and the GPS in one column, in the other, the words they were afraid to say twice. The sounds were described as deliberate and mechanical, like massive hammering or construction work, taking place deep beneath the forest floor. That line wouldn't let me sleep. I knew our boundaries, our permits, our warnings, and where the roads dead-ended. One had a right to build beneath the leaf litter. No one had a reason to set a metronome in the roots. I went back through every page. Some witnesses were quiet people who joked about too much coffee. Others had the courtesy to be scared without pretending otherwise. Again and again, the pattern returned. A stubborn liturgy. However, the consistency and specificity of the reports began to concern Webb as more witnesses came forward, spelling mistakes aside. I was the Webb in those sentences. The concern was not a bureaucratic one. It was the simple arithmetic of repetition. Too many different mouths making the same sound with their stories. Then came the refrain. The sounds were always described as rhythmic pounding, occurring in patterns of 3 strikes, followed by a pause, then repeating endlessly throughout the night. 3, rest. 3, rest. Not the way a wind lulls and returns, not the way a creek swallows a stone and troubles itself again downstream. It walked. Witnesses reported that the sounds seemed to move through the forest floor, traveling from location to location, as if something was working its way through an underground network. That was the verb that ruined my appetite. Working. Work implies intent. Intent implies a listener. So I went where the stories converged. I slipped off the last human trail and took deer paths and bare lanes until the canopy knitted shut above me. I carried more water than pride and chose a shelf of soil that could see the ground, but not the stars. I wanted to watch the earth, not the sky. The words I later used for the file were square-shouldered and dull, just the way supervisors liked them. He established a base camp in a remote section of Catalucci Valley, far from any roads or facilities, where he could conduct extended observation without interference from park visitors or normal human activity. True, if unhelpful. What the sentence did not say was that I could feel my own pulse in my teeth before the first instrument left its case. The first pulses didn't announce themselves. They laid claim. They filled the space beneath my ribs the way a second heart might. Confident, regular, more patient than anything that grows in daylight. I wrote as if writing had the power to turn a visitation into a note. The sound was unmistakably artificial, too regular and purposeful to be natural geological activity. I stood. The rhythm braided itself through the dirt and the stones, polite at first, then exacting. Each series of 3 strikes was perfectly timed with identical force and duration, suggesting mechanical precision rather than random natural processes. I moved and it moved elsewhere, not fleeing, but taking the long way to prove it could. Then came stillness. The kind of silence that lets your hearing tell lies. For a breath, I believed it had passed through me and gone about its business. That was before the earth exhaled light. The sudden cessation of the pounding sounds and the appearance of the pulsating light marked a turning point in Ranger Marcus Webb's investigation. In a report, those words sit obediently on a line. In the clearing, they unfurled themselves into a ring, faint, undeniable. The color of a storm, too far to help and too close to ignore. The light wasn't blinding but carried an otherworldly quality, like bioluminescence from some unknown source deep beneath the earth. It pulsed with the same 3 count and, with every pulse, made the dark seem less like an absence and more like a mouth. I packed without rushing because rushing turns fear into an accident. The light faded as if conceding a point. The rhythm returned somewhere else, as if to remind me that distance is an illusion underfoot. At the station desk, I used the kind of language that gets you through a review meeting without a second question. He filed an official report, carefully worded to describe the incident as a potential geological anomaly to avoid scrutiny from his superiors. Then I sent rock crumbs and digital files to addresses that later stopped returning my emails. And then I did what I always do when a question refuses to die. I went looking for other people who had learned not to answer it. Sleep requires surrender. I didn't have any surrender left. The archives felt safer than dreams. They are not grand, just boxes and dust, and the smell of paper that has waited too long for anyone to ask it a fair question. I signed out folders that had survived 3 office moves and half a dozen supervisors. Every page taught me how other rangers had been taught, to say less than they saw, to leave the edges of fear out of the paragraphs. But a mission has a handwriting, and once you learn to read it, you hear the missing sentences as loudly as if they were typed in red. Patterns revealed themselves the way rocks do when the creek drops. What he uncovered was chilling. At least a dozen other incidents across parks like Yosemite, Shenandoah, and the Everglades described similar underground sounds, often accompanied by inexplicable lights or vibrations. The dates were spread wide enough to make a person feel safe. If a person believed that calendars prevent hunger, the phrasing matched across districts that didn't speak to each other. The rhythm matched. The reluctance to put a name to it matched most of all. Some authors borrowed the vocabulary of geology and immediately looked embarrassed by it. A few hinted at something they were ashamed to find themselves considering. Intention in the stone. One letter kept me longer than the rest, as the writer had drawn a narrow oval in the margin, so the way a person circles a word he can't bear to say, and he didn't claim to know what he had found. He did claim that the way there was not the way back, and that the walls had the wrong texture, as if water and time had been denied their usual work, and the tunnels were unnaturally smooth, as if carved by something other than natural erosion, and led to a chamber filled with geometric carvings that didn't match any known cultural artifacts. He sealed the place behind him, then sealed his mouth by retiring. I made phone calls I had no business making, to colleagues who trusted me just enough to answer before deciding whether they should hang up. They told me their versions in voices careful as surgeons, a backcountry site where the ground rose beneath a sleeping bag like breath under a blanket, a cypress bay where lights braided through standing water and died when someone spoke aloud, a high meadow where cattle avoided a perfect circle of grass as if there were a price for entering, and then, without fuss, returned a season later as though a debt had been paid. Each story had the same preface. This is nothing official. I went back to the valley alone one more time, knowing that leaving witnesses out of the picture was both good science and terrible judgment. I stood where the ring had breathed and pressed my palm flat to the dirt, expecting nothing more than coolness and grit. I'm not ashamed to say I felt watched, and not from the trees, but from below. The way you feel watched when you know a door exists in a wall you have always mistaken for solid, somewhere downslope and right. The 3 count touched the edge of hearing, so faint that I could convince myself I was remembering it rather than meeting it again. That was enough. A test would not be wasted here. When I brought the idea of instrumentation to a few people who knew how to keep secrets without letting them rot, their eyebrows didn't move. There is a way to make an experiment sound like routine maintenance if you choose your nouns carefully. We chose them. I signed my name beneath 3 others, and we began collecting the kind of gear that listens where ears cannot, for tremor and pressure, for the little lies rock tells when something insists on moving through it. We entered as if the place were a church we didn't want to disturb, and no announcements, no notices, nothing bright. The valley was itself, elk prints where the mud remembered, tannin dark water sliding past old roots, ridgelines laid down like spines. Again, we planted our equipment where the witness accounts converged. They set up a grid of sensors to map any subsurface activity, hoping to pinpoint the source of the sounds. Cables stitched the ground to a console the size of a suitcase. Lines became numbers. Numbers pretended to be tame. For a while, the earth behaved. The chart idled so gently I thought about apologizing to my friends for the hours I had asked them to give me. We even let ourselves believe for a dangerous little minute that we had frightened whatever it was away. Then the quiet rearranged itself into a pattern we did not grant permission to exist. Triplets marched down the paper like small, exact boots. The seismic readings showed activity originating from a depth of over 100 feet, far deeper than any known cave system in the area. That number tilted the map in my mind. No cave charted here went that deep. No tourist brochure had the vocabulary for a thing that did. It wasn't only the instruments that noticed. A pressure I didn't have a word for gathered at the base of the skull. A flavor of metal at the back of the tongue that didn't belong to the creek. And then, a careful nausea that treated courage like a joke. The sensors also picked up low-frequency vibrations that caused headaches and nausea among the team. Forcing them to abandon the experiment prematurely, we told ourselves we were stopping because the data was sufficient. The truth was plainer. A body that wants to stand still does not do math well. Before we pulled the cables, we caught something we had not trained ourselves to expect. The pulses arranged themselves, not merely as beats, but as a sequence that refused randomness. The vibrations formed a pattern that wasn't random, but followed a complex sequence, one almost like a code or language. None of us said the word language out loud. That would have felt like summoning. I carried the files to a person whose job it is to hear signal inside noise. She didn't want her name on any of it, which made me trust her more. And we sat in a small office where the blinds always seemed to be closed no matter what you do with them. She listened. She waited. The way a careful musician waits before the first note. And then she chose words that fit like a calibrated wrench. A linguistics expert brought in to consult suggested that the patterns bore similarities to communication signals. Though they didn't match any human language or known animal vocalizations, I watched the relief cross her face when she added the second half of that sentence. Relief that she had not trapped herself into naming the wrong thing. Possibilities lined up like cautious animals. Geologic resonance shaped by fault geometry. Water hammer effects in buried channels. Human hardware miles away. Each fell apart under her math. I stopped sleeping in the deep backcountry after that. Fear wasn't the reason, not exactly. It was respect for a pattern not mine to interrupt. When Webb's obsession with the underground sounds took a toll on his mental health, that is how the file would summarize the next chapter. And though the sentence is clean as a scalpel, its edges are true. Concentration frayed. The rhythm appeared during tasks that should have been automatic, filling out permits, teaching fire safety to volunteers. On trails I'd walked for years, trunks seemed to lean toward each other as if comparing notes about me. I moved to a desk job because it allowed the appearance of sanity. The rhythm did not accept the transfer. On the better days I still went out, never to the old campsite. Never alone for long, I would stop where the ground felt oddly light, the way ground sometimes does above an old root ball, and I would hold still until the urge to stamp my foot like an angry child passed. If I ever answered the rhythm, I did not want to admit it. The park did what parks do. It outlasted my ambition. The valleys kept trading fog with the ridges, and the elk kept forgetting that humans are capable of cruelty. I learned how to make curiosity look like maintenance and how to slip hard questions into soft answers. Quiet changes crept across a few maps and signs, changes only the kind of people who read minutes from meetings would notice. I did not resist them. There are kinds of safety that have nothing to do with railings. Official language remained where we left it, a wide umbrella to keep everyone dry during meetings. Seismic monitoring continues, but the National Park Service has downplayed the phenomenon, attributing it to natural geological shifts. Unofficially, the story crossed boundaries like water. Not because anyone shouted it, but because fear has a handwriting that people recognize in places they've never been. I kept collecting. Webb's research files, now stored privately, contain over 50 reports of similar incidents across the U.S., suggesting a widespread phenomenon that defies conventional explanation. Some arrived as photocopies from a friend of a friend, some as a towel-wrapped thumb drive left at my office door like a casserole after a funeral. None of them sat easily in the hand. On certain afternoons, I wonder if what we heard is older than the rock. On certain nights, I wonder if it is not language at all, but a lock, testing keys, knocking at both sides of a door to confirm there is a door. I have watched light breathe in a circle without fire. I have seen birds fold themselves toward the ground all at once as if gravity had shifted its mind. I have watched a fox stand still in an open place without fear, head canted, listening to what I could not bear to. People ask me simple questions in good faith. What should we do if we hear it? Should we answer? Will it go away if we refuse to be its echo? I tell them the only truth that does not pretend to be comfort. We answer whether we mean to or not. Every footstep across the old networks is a reply. Every tent stake is a reply. The weight of us is a reply. Whatever listens below learns our names by pressure, the cadence of blood in the wrists, the stutter in a knee, the old fracture that changes how a boot hits the trail. The rhythmic pounding still echoes through the valley on certain nights. A haunting reminder that some secrets lie buried too deep to be uncovered, and some sounds are better left unheard. If there is a door, then staying on this side of it is a choice, and I make that choice for now. I lock it with silence and step away. And still, when the wind dies and the soil is warm from a day that did not mean harm, I feel a count return to the bones of the hills. 1, 2, 3, rest. 1, 2, 3, rest. Now, I don't press my ear to the ground anymore. It does not need the help. Story number 10. The trail gave me back my body, but not my hours, and at the summit, the world held its breath and waited for me to make a mistake. My journal remembers what my camera refuses to admit. Something up there doesn't push, it invites. I have walked Angel's Landing twice and come home half a ranger each time. I sign my name on the station log with a steady hand I do not recognize. I had always trusted the mountain, its switchbacks and chains, its clean morning light, to clarify what mattered. Instead, it blurred the edges of my days until even my reflection seemed to arrive a moment too late. The radio chatter from the other desks drifts past me. I file the incident the way a person folds a torn map, keeping the ripped edges together so the trail still looks continuous. I decide to speak plainly, only to the page that does not argue back. Ranger Emily Harper's experience on Angel's Landing left her shaken, and I am the person who came back carrying that sentence like a pack. I do not write the words everyone expects. I do not say hallucination, dehydration, a trick of altitude. I do not say miracle. In the official box, I type something safe, then close the lid on it. Harper's official report was deliberately vague. The agency has 2 phrases ready to bless and shelve what will not behave: equipment, malfunction, and possible disorientation due to altitude. Those are the words I hand to the job. The words I keep belong to me, and they are heavier than gear. I keep the notebook, still smelling faintly of dust and iron, the notes in her journal that refused to let the day end. I had scratched them while the path presented the same boulder, the same slant of shadow, the same distant hawk drawing loops it should have escaped. The lines tilt where my hand pressed too hard, like current wrinkling a shallow stream. My entries repeat on purpose, landmarks repeating, the sun refusing to move, a growing sense of being watched by an unseen presence. Do not trust memory, I trust insistence. The devices we worship were of no use. Her camera showed no photos. A lid clamped over vision. Her GPS logged no anomalies, unless panic counts as a data point. If I had trusted silicon more than skin, I would have called it a boring day and moved on. But the body knows when it has been edited. So I called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. Daniel Kim has a voice that escorts you to steadier ground even when it only says, hello. He listened while I stepped around the parts that would get me benched. then said he'd go with me, and a week later, we loaded redundancies, a backup handset, spare batteries, a pen I trusted more than a lens, and we climbed as if we were walking into an explanation already paid for. We clipped a square witness to my shoulder, a body camera to record the ascent, and made our way up through the murmuring crowds into a higher, sharper quiet. The lower trail behaved. Greetings, careful passes at the chains, a rhythm of breath and caution. Above the chains, the air gathered itself and turned to glass at the top. The canyon held me the way a photograph holds a blink. Daniel said my name softly, as if the place might startle. I heard myself answer and did not believe it was mine. Then the sky removed its fingers from the wind, and the birds forgot their lines. No birds, no wind, just an unnatural stillness, as if the world had agreed to listen. We checked the units. They did not agree with each other or with us. Numbers jittered and leapt, coordinates that jumped between locations miles apart. Like a child flipping channels, later the files would show a block of stubborn absence where motion should have been, only static during the 20 minutes they spent at the summit. While Daniel and I remembered walking the ridge, pointing, trading the dry humor of people pretending they are not impressed. We both saw the same landscape frozen in time. The machinery saw refusal. I did not linger. The first time had taught me the feel of edges closing. We started down, but the place is greedy and learns your name. On the narrow ledge, I felt pressure like a hand resting on my shoulder, not force. Suggestion. Daniel later admitted the same gravity, an overwhelming urge to stay at the top, to wait until something revealed its face. My entry from that second patrol describes it as a voice without words. I trusted the older part of my mind that still knows how to leave an altar untouched. We descended. Back at the station, I went hunting patterns as if they were exits. I wanted repetition, not answers. Zion is a cathedral of stone. Every pillar is history pretending to be present. In box files with the scent of old rain, I found stories taped to coffee-stained memos. What she found was chilling. At least 7 other reports from Zion and other national parks across decades. You could shuffle like cards. Hikers and rangers spoke of lost time, repeated trail segments, and sudden returns to earlier points in their journeys. A few lines read like confessions sighed into a desk drawer. A few read like instructions for surviving a language you do not speak. I called the people with badges of another kind. A geophysicist offered patience and caveats. A psychologist offered grounding techniques and good sense. Their words were tidy, their concern real. Jargon lined up like cairns on a ledge. Unique geological features, rare electromagnetic anomalies, even a cautious nod toward temporal distortions. Useful ideas. None of them a match for that particular silence, the one that treats your heartbeat as if it were a key. Sleep became a hallway with receding doors, plagued by dreams of walking the same trail endlessly. I wore 2 watches to bed and woke to make sure they agreed. I made lists until the lists became architecture. Her colleagues noticed her growing anxiety and reluctance to work alone, so I learned to radiate normal from a distance. It is a skill many rangers pick up. How to look unshaken while your days tilt slightly to the left. The stories kept coming. Some arrived from disposable addresses after midnight. Some arrived in person, told low at the back counter by people with pack-strapped tan lines. They spoke of brief moments of déjà vu or missing hours, of compasses suggesting impossible degrees away, of trails that folded like zippers. I did not grant each one belief. I granted each one kinship. I drew lines between them, and the shape that emerged was not a trail but a pull. I do not need an official stance to validate what I carry. Internal guidance asks us to monitor the people who stay too long and to offer gentle course corrections. It does not speak about unpredictable conditions in a way that scares visitors. It certainly does not mention a lingering fear that the loop is waiting for her to step back into its grasp. But rangers know there are places you honor. By leaving them alone, I honor Angel's Landing by staying away. What remains is the work of telling myself a story I can live inside. At the end of each patrol, I write one sentence and let it adjust its weight on the page until it feels honest. A reminder that time in the wilderness doesn't always follow the rules we expect. If I say it enough, perhaps time will forgive me for straying, and the mountain will keep what it took and return the rest as weather. Part 2. This part is not for the formal log or the safety video or the kiosk where families touch the screen to borrow bravery for a day. It is for the ones who come back with grit on their tongues and names engraved lightly on their ribs. It is for Daniel, who said he understood and then quietly rearranged his patrols so he did not have to prove that twice. It is for the version of me who wakes into mornings stalled between frames and chooses motion anyway. I have started thinking of the canyon as intention rather than place. The sandstone does not merely rise, it leans. You bring a pulse, and the canyon tests for resonance. If the two align, you feel recognized. If they lock, you feel kept. That was the pull at the summit, not a trap, not a threat, but recognition so complete it felt like mercy. We are not built to hold mercy that long. It becomes weight. In town, I walk a little slower, as if sidewalks might fold back on themselves. I pause at crosswalks a beat longer than necessary, rehearsing forward. The watches tick in agreement, and agreement is not yet trust. I am the person with a spare of everything. Daniel teases me less. We have earned our redundancies. When I let the quiet deepen, I try to name what resists names. Maybe it is a seam where attention pools. Maybe it is weather the forecasts will not admit. Perhaps it is geology speaking in a dialect the body translates as repetition. Or perhaps it is the simplest truth. We are clumsy readers of a text too large. And sometimes our place in the sentence resets until we learn the grammar of the line. None of these theories ask to be right. They ask me to keep walking. Letters arrive. A woman from the North Rim writes that she walked a ridge twice without turning. A man from Yosemite says, a single day looped, and his beard noticed. A teenager from Bryce swears his phone, and the sky agreed, and he still lost a whole afternoon. Each apology for sounding absurd could be folded into a welcome. I answer them like family. Because what else do you call people who have learned the same wrong lesson from the same beautiful teacher? Sometimes I take the long way home through the east entrance and stop where the road narrows and every bend earns a fresh cathedral. I do not go up. I listen for birds, for wind, for the way my name changes as the cliffs draw near. The silence, I fear, is not emptiness. It is a fullness that tries to speak for me. The canyon borrowing my cadence as if it were its own. If I hear that kind of quiet, I drive. The last time I dreamed of the loop, I made a decision inside it. I stopped trying to escape. I stood in the light and answered in the only language I own. Inhale, exhale, a count that does not beg for progress. The dream did not break, it thinned. I woke knowing I am allowed to refuse invitations with no end. The next day I trained a new ranger. I taught her to check bolts and watch for the marbles of gravel that can roll a foot the wrong way. I taught her that turning back can be the bravest route forward. If this has happened to you, I will not advise doubt. Doubt is a ditch. Ankles go there to learn humility. Find an anchor, something the pause cannot argue with. Mine is ink and paper. Daniel's is inventory. Yours might be a child calling from another room or a stone you pocketed from nowhere important. Carry it where no loop can follow. I am not finished with this place because it is not finished with me. I will keep showing up for ordinary miracles, a family that returns glowing where fear might have lodged, a hiker who turns back at the right moment and calls it wisdom, not defeat, a sky that learns new blues in a single afternoon. I will keep not going back to the summit that asked for my name. The canyon may keep its secret, I will keep mine. We are all tempted by explanation. It lifts weight with words. Sometimes the better work is redistribution. A little to the gear, a little to the partner, a little to the patient habit of writing the plain truth where no one else has to read it. Here is mine. I was taken out of sequence and returned without proof. I was offered perfect attention and refused to be kept by it. I came back altered and chose to keep the changes. If someone asks whether Angel's Landing is worth it, I will tell the truth the way truths should be told, with directions, with care, with a map that includes the unmarked vehicle. I will show where the chains begin, where the ledges thin, where the vistas bless the arrival and the descent blesses the refusal to linger. And as they set out, I will add one line that sounds like a weather note and carries the whole story. Be mindful of the quiet that waits to know your name. Story number 11. I speak now because silence has not kept anyone safer. The forest teaches with patience and penalties, and I have learned both. There are lines you only notice after you cross them. The air thins, the trees seem to lean, and something old begins to pay attention. I once believed every mystery would yield to training and a map. Then I met the glowing eyes above the waterline of Lake Ozette, and belief lost its footing. If you're looking for comfort, you won't find it here. What you will find is a trail of notes, a handful of frames, and a decision that keeps me awake. Call this a confession or a field report that never made it into the archive. Either way, it's the closest I can get to the truth without inviting it back. I didn't become a ranger to tell ghost stories, and I signed on for blisters, fog, and rules. Still, the first rule I broke was pretending nothing had happened. That night outside Lake Ozette, after guiding the terrified campers away, I stood on the dock and tried to slow my breathing. It wasn't fear that kept me there. It was calibration, trying to understand the space I was in and what it had allowed to stand inside it with me. I told myself the mind is a projector. I told myself fatigue makes phantoms. I told myself the lens lies. Underneath those pep talks was a quieter recognition. I had been questioning the boundaries of the natural world since the first field season. The difference now was that the question had finally turned around and looked back.
Back at the station, I wrote my official report. The sentence felt like swallowing a stone. Unidentified wildlife encounter. It preserved face and likely my career, while betraying my memory in the same breath. Off the record, I started investigating similar reports. It turns out curiosity makes a good lockpick. I slipped through filing cabinets, scanned microfilm, called retired rangers on landlines that rang too long. I built a constellation out of footnotes and rumor until the shape emerged over the past 40 years. People had seen tall, amorphous figures with glowing eyes in remote areas at night. They described primal fear, equipment malfunctions, wood stole, and no physical traces left behind. One yellowed memo referenced shadow beings near burial trees. In my training, context is king. In my gut, something older wore the crown. I asked for a return patrol. They gave me Torres and Chen, both smart and steady, with appetites for the thorny work. We went in evenly spaced, with enough redundancy to make any failure meaningful. We cinched sensor straps around trunks and hung data loggers wrapped like gifts no one wanted. Chen checked calibrations twice. Torres walked the perimeter until the ground remembered his boots. Our plan was boring, my favorite style of plan. The forest complied. At first, day 1, elk sign and the parallel scrawl of raccoon claws. Day 2, a rain line on my sleeve and nothing else. Then the third night unbuttoned itself. It started with a chime from the monitor. Motion sensors at the north loop, then west, then 2 alarms at once. We moved quiet and careful through the salal. Radios low, nothing. No branch bend, no brush parted. The grid kept alerting. Nothing owned the shadows we aimed at.
Our gear recorded the ticks anyway, data for dawn. We left the cameras pivoted toward the game trail because the trail was honest if nothing else. When the playback rolled later, the screen lifted the hairs on my arms. 3 seconds of what looked like dust, then a smear of light among the hemlocks. Chen froze the frame. There, glowing orbs suspended well above any owl path, drifting with the hesitation of thought. We catalogued them, called them artifacts, moved on. I kept telling myself this was pressure and light and lens, but the forest was patient with my denial. Torres poured coffee and said what I'd refused to say. He felt watched. He's the sort who weighs every word and only spends them on the obvious. We walked back into the night with our measured lights. The air felt as if it had been thinking for a long time and had nearly made up its mind. Another alert. Chen held up the tablet. The data plotted spiking, falling, spiking again. She whispered, not with her mouth, but with the way she squared her shoulders, that she wanted an explanation we could put in a report. The best we got was one treacherous frame, a vague, humanoid shape at the edge of our sight. Eyes glowing faintly against the dark. One frame only, as if the forest had granted us a postage stamp of admission and then revoked it. We argued, politely, about thresholds and controls. We listed what it wasn't. Not a trespasser, no tracks. Not a cat, the height was wrong. Not weather, no wind, no sway. The list of what it wasn't grew until it felt like a kind of definition. Back in my bunk, I made a second list, the rules I would keep. I would not go alone. I would not step into the cedars without telling someone. I would not confuse courage with curiosity. I did not sleep much. When sleep came, so did the eyes. They stood just beyond the tree line and waited for the part of me that always moves toward a threshold. You will see, the next week we return by day. Day is generous even when it's grey. We found a boundary we had not mapped, a ring of old-growth cedar with lightning scars and healing seams. I offered water to the roots and an apology to the air, not because I thought ceremony would convince the unseen to be seen, but because I understand that permission is a form of navigation. We set smaller devices at the periphery. The sun moved, the understory breathed. Dusk arrived like a long exhale. Our mics recorded sounds, the handbook calls non-directional, frequencies that hide in moss and skin. The graph printed itself into a jagged skyline, then fell flat. Torres looked at me. Chen checked power, then cable, then battery. Dead. We still had the handheld, though, and the old trick of standing still. The sensation returned, not a touch, not a temperature, but presence itself, pressing lightly against the idea of me. When the first bright point appeared between two trunks, I wanted it to be a spider's eye catching our beam. It hovered too long for that. Another point answered 5 yards to the left, Maciel, and a third higher up, moving with the odd grace of a leaf, sinking in water that isn't there. I named them what the file names had named them. Glowing orbs. Then the smell came. Cedar pitch and wet stone. Like stepping into a chapel with its windows made of bark. Torres said my name. Chen didn't speak. The points rearranged into a suggestion of stature, then dissolved like breath against glass. We backed out. Sometimes retreat is the only correct move. At the station, we wrote it all down with the care of people who want to be believed. We included the data, the frame, the map. I drew the cedar ring and labeled it with the caution I reserve for cliffs and currents. The official guidance from above would later say what it had to say. Wildlife or optical illusions? The internal memo changed, though it now advised we avoid solo patrols in certain sectors after dark. On paper, this reads like liability armor. In the body, it feels like confession. The longer I work here, the more I suspect that certain places are not meant to be crossed so much as kept. Chen kept digging. She found accounts I'd missed. Stories about guardians who protect certain areas of the forest, punishing those who lingered too long. I do not romanticize the past. I keep a list of what history gets wrong. but I also know that warnings, like trails, are made by repeated use. We revisited the campers we'd pulled out that first night. They described the same thing I had not wanted to put in writing. No sound worth noting, the sense of being weighed, and the instant, absolute knowledge that turning your back would be a mistake. At home, my routines calcified. I checked locks without quite deciding to. I kept the recorder near the bed like a talisman. I ran until my lungs burned clean. None of it helped much. The dreams multiplied, recurring dreams of glowing eyes that did not approach and did not leave, which is its own kind of trap, I told Chen. She told me about a story in which the watchers are not hunters but boundaries with a face. A boundary with a face is a kind of mercy. It lets you know where not to go. The park's posture hardened into the familiar, more cameras, increased surveillance, more trail cameras at choke points, and still no definitive evidence. That sentence has been typed so often, it could be a stamp. Meanwhile, the back channel, ranger to ranger, text to text, carried the real brief: carry redundancies, carry respect, carry your fear as a tool, and do not wander into the places the maps leave blank. I continued my routes, but I steers clear of Lake Azette and the Cedar Ring. I keep a private journal for what cannot be submitted. My opinion, for whatever it's worth, some parts of the Olympic are a balance, and the watcher is the counterweight. I will not call it a spirit. Spirit is a human word. I will not call it an animal. Animal is a human category. I will say that when we stayed too long in the wrong circle, the climate of the place changed, and I will say that presence is measurable. Though not always with devices, I will say that the fear we felt was not panic, but boundary sense, like standing at the lip of a waterfall on a moonless night and knowing there is nothing beneath your next step but air. This is not a cautionary tale about quitting the work. I'm still here. The trail needs clearing whether or not the dark grows eyes, but I have revised my rules. I leave offerings of care, mended fences, packed out trash, a slower pace where the old cedars close ranks. I teach interns how to listen without naming. I do not trespass for the sake of proof. My report. The one you're reading now is the closest I will come to proof. Believe me or don't, the forest will not bargain either way. If you go, go with a guide. If you camp, choose the spot the wind chooses. If you feel the mind of the place settle around you like a cloak, sit still until it loosens again. And if you see the glowing eyes, remember that not all encounters require advance or retreat. Sometimes the correct response is the shape of your breath in your chest and the knowledge that this, too, is a habitat, one you are visiting, not owning. In the ledger of explanations, I submit this. The watcher is a posture the land takes when it has been pressed. That posture stands, considers, and waits you out. In another era, it might have been called a saint or a sentinel, a curse or a cure. We call it a problem because we want a permit to move forward. The Cedar Ring never says no. It says, not now. It says, not like this. I still get called out at night, and I still answer. I carry redundancies. And I carry the memory of that single frame that should not exist. I study maps that leave generous blank space where we think the good stuff isn't. That is usually where the good stuff hides, and sometimes on the far shore of Lake Ozette. I stop and let the dark adjust to me before I adjust to it. The air cools, the understory waits, and in that waiting, I remember why I came here in the first place, to be remade by something I can serve but never completely define. So this is the record I can live with, an encounter that proved nothing, corrected everything, and left me with a haunting reminder that place is not just coordinates, but a living agreement. The watcher stands for the clause we tend to skip. I have signed it in my own way. If you read this and feel only skepticism, that's fine. Skepticism keeps us from falling off edges, but leave a corner in your doubt for what stands lurking in the shadows of an old-growth night, for the entities that defy explanation, for the place where human understanding falls short and respect begins.